right, so let's get started. So welcome everyone. This is the Center for Insect Biomanufacturing and Innovation's first animal welfare seminar. It's focused on insect livestock health and disease. My name is Megan Barrett. I'm a co-PI at the center. I'm also chair of our Animal Welfare Committee, which focuses on the health and well-being of both insect livestock and the animals that insects in our sector can support nutritionally as feed ingredients. I'm delighted you all could attend today. We've got an absolutely fantastic lineup, 5 amazing speakers representing industry, academia, veterinary medicine. They have a wealth of experience and knowledge to share with us today about insect livestock health and disease around the world, so we're in very good hands. Now, for those unfamiliar with CIBI, the Center for Insect Biomanufacturing and Innovation, we do a tremendous amount of foundational pre-competitive research to drive the growth of the insect agriculture sector. We serve as a hub connecting industry with academic expertise on a variety of key research areas. Think genomics, nutrition, animal health, processing, electrochemical detection, and much more. These insights help power innovation, sustainability, and economic growth for the sector. We also host research seminars, which you can find on our YouTube page, which is also where the talks today will be posted as they will be recorded. If you're interested in learning more about the work that we do, you can check us out online at insectcenter.org. We also have our fall meeting happening next month, November 6th and 7th in Oregon, as well as online. So anyone interested in attending that meeting should send an email to hello@insectcenter.org for more information. Okay, so enough about CIBI generally, on to our main event for today. To begin, I'll make just a few notes. Speakers will each have about a half hour to present. If we have time, we'll allow for a few questions right after each of the speakers. But if not, that's okay, because there's plenty of time for questions during the panel discussion that's happening at the end of all of the talks today. So that panel discussion will run from 11:40 to 12:30 Eastern time. That's 5:40 to 6:30 p.m. Central European time. Attendees are also free to ask questions at any time. You can just go to that little Q&A tab that is at the bottom of your screen. If you click that, you'll be able to pop your questions right into that Q&A section and write your question into us. If you don't see questions after you submitted it, that's okay. I can see them, and I'll be moderating the Q&A during the panel discussion or at the end of each of our speakers' talks. So as long as you've submitted it, it's okay. I'll see it, and I'll be selecting from the many questions to make sure we have a diversity of questions asked for our Q&A sections. So with that, I'm going to turn things over just a minute or two early to Benoit Jonet to get started. So to introduce our first speaker, Benoit Jonet is a French agricultural engineer. He has expertise in farm management, animal nutrition, health, and welfare in a very global context. He's worked in many international locations. He's joining us today from Invaires, which is a company in central France that is focused on mealworm production and providing a local and circular solution to the challenges of both animal and human nutrition. And with that, I'll have you share your screen.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. That's okay for everyone? Sounds good? Okay, I'm presenting here for the IPIF, which is an international, this is an international organization for food, for insects, for food and feed. So before we start, I'd like to give you an overview of who I am and who is Invaires. So I am Benoit Jonet. I'm business development manager for this company, and Invaires is a yellow mealworm producer right in the middle of France, in the center of France. We are aiming to develop a new decentralized agriculture business model based on Tenebrio molito production, yellow mealworms, and this together with local regional players, farmers, cooperatives, banks, and investors. For us, farmers are at the heart of our model because we believe they are the best equipped to rear animals. If you look at the right of the picture, the way we work, we develop ourselves a hatchery where we grow and we make the reproduction and the hatching of the eggs of Tenebrio. And then we bring the small larvae to farms, and the farmer will grow them for us. So it's a bit based on the model of the poultry production with the hatchery and the farms. Each farm for now we developed are 1,000 square meters. So it's not a big farm, and there are 10,000 square feet about. Okay. So my content today, I will explain you who is IPIF and what we do, the overview of the European insect sector, what we think about welfare for all producer, the industry and insect welfare, and the guidance document we are working on. And also at the end, I will introduce you what we did on the guide on good hygiene practices. Okay. So IPIF is composed of 54 members, and these members come from 22 countries, including 15 EU countries, as well as from other European countries like Switzerland, Norway. So the green frame, the top and left, you can see there are member and associated members. So it's quite a lot of producers with different sizes. In addition to insect producers, our association also include academic actors at the bottom right, like university and so on, as well as operators who are active at different stages of the insect value chain. For example, equipment and technology providers. And we also have several national insect associations at the bottom left, like FFPIDI, which is a French insect producer association, also VENIC in the Netherlands, as well as CZ Insect Association in Czech Republic. So these are all members all over Europe. Okay. IPIF is a EU insect sector umbrella organization. IPIF is based in Brussels for Europe, and we're serving as interlocutor between the industry and the EU institutions. IPIF works together with this institution in order to develop and appropriate legislative and regulatory frameworks that correspond to the reality of insect-producing companies. One of our main goals is, considering the recent nature of our industry at EU level, is to set standards for the industry, ensuring that we are compliant, but at the same time, we want to promote the best practices to ensure our sector is responsible and committed to the highest EU standard. So that's basically what is IPIF doing. So you can see here the picture. So basically in Europe, what we grow is BSF, the black soldier fly, on the left of this two picture, and on the right bottom, we grow as well mealworms. That's the main two insects that are grown in Europe. I would say BSF is close to 80% and mealworms 20%, and some other few more insects otherwise. Okay. The EU insect sector already contributed since 2015, so 10 years only, with more than 1.2 billion euro of investment in the EU economy. Predominantly composed of SMEs, small and medium enterprises. The sector has passed a critical threshold and has set its mark to be commercially interesting. In some segments of the market which are set to become promising for insect producer, more recently in the area of pet food, aqua feed ingredient, also bird feed. We have a diversity in types of farms, operational sizes, and production model. For example, you have the full liners, more big company, and also decentralized models like the one of Inverse I'm representing here. Our sector emerged with high level of integration with several other production systems. We are working together at local level with agro industries and other farmers. To date, the industry has created 3,500 jobs in Europe, including 1,000 direct jobs. So if regulatory and policy incentive continue aligned with the sector, we have the potential to create up to 30,000 jobs by 2030. Okay. The sector, despite its emerging nature, has overcome several regulatory obstacles, set forward legislative and regulatory developments towards an increased production. However, we still have many other challenges and other regulatory challenges to overcome, which can have a significant opportunity for our sector, such as a wider authorization for feeding substrate, and also, for instance, a better recognition of the frass to be recognized as a full organic fertilizer. Okay. The mentioned regulatory advancement make more sense than ever in today's reality. When the EU tries to tackle food waste and set forward reduction targets, with the authorization of wider feeding substrates, the EU insect sector could have a valued contribution. We estimate about 50 million tons of food waste in Europe. Moreover, considering the current geopolitical instability, trade uncertainties, and increasingly climate changes related events, it is more important than ever to increase the effort to accelerate transition towards more sustainable diets and increase domestic production. Insect production, due to its circular nature, being produced in controlled environment, can have a significant role in strengthening food sovereignty and resilience to external shock. Okay. Why insect welfare matters for insect producer? It is more than anyone could think. Although today we have to recognize in Europe there is very few regulatory on insect welfare, but promoting in EU high welfare standard is not just an ethical imperative, it's also closely linked to production efficiency and product quality. We believe that stressed insects exhibit higher mortality, slower growth, and can be more susceptible, which directly impact the sustainability and economic viability. Therefore, for us, good welfare is synonymous with good farming practice. The European insect sector is committed to leading the way in the responsible development of this innovative field. This includes a proactive, science-based, and precautionary approach to insect welfare, ensuring our growth is aligned with the high value and standard expected by the EU and its citizens. As a key pillar of our work, IPIF is actively promoting development and implementation of good practices for insect welfare throughout the farming and production process. We recognize that as a responsible livestock sector, the well-being of the animal in our care is a scientific, ethical, and operational priority. While this scientific field of insect welfare is still evolving, our approach is firmly precautionary. We advocate for measures that respect the physiological needs of insects based on the latest evidence and the application of the 5 freedoms framework adapted to insects. So the IPIF initiative includes the production of guidance document. Following, we had a first publication in a fact sheet on insect welfare in 2022, and IPIF is currently developing an EU guide on good practice for the welfare of farm insect. Okay, so that's the way where we are so far. So in this first, what would say? In the fact sheet we produce, we base our work on the 5 freedoms and published in 2022. And the 5 freedoms are the one from Bramble. Okay. So you can see, I won't develop there, but this is something you can find in your website. We have all the freedom here, sorry. So we have freedom for discomfort, freedom from pain, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. Okay. So all this kind of freedom we have to respect about the feed, about the environment, about slaughtering and stunning, and so on. Okay. So we want to respect this Bramble recommendation as long as it takes into account insect product producer specificity and also invertebrate characteristics. So the animal welfare rule must adapt to the specific reality of insect production. Okay. And we work closely on these topics when we develop our guide or our thinking with the EFSA, which is Europe Food and Safety Authorities. Again, this you can find on our website. And following this core, what we did in 2022 and what we are running right now, we call for action. And we call for all insect producers to abide by high standard of animal welfare and care for insect well-being. We call for any new policy or legislation in this area to be science-based and take into account the specificities of insect species and the technical realities of insect industrial production. We call for more funding to be made available for research on insect welfare. Of course, we still have a lot to do and to demonstrate. And we call for continuous dialogue with EU decision makers and non-institutional partners to maximize fair solution for insect producers in order to promote best practices and production activities. So far, we advocate for animal welfare rules must adapt to specific realities of insect production, and further research activity should be devoted to the subject of insect welfare. And I know that in the US, in North America, you are probably more advanced than us on these welfare topics. So the EU guide on good practice for the welfare of farm insects is promoting exchanges between our academic members, including leading university and our industry members. Further calling for further engagement with other academic experts leading scientific advice on insect welfare. I would say we can cooperate with the Indiana University on this way. This guide to be proposed by endorsement by the EU institution has set forward standards for the welfare of EU farmed insects. So we have to work on environment and density. So the evidence here, the study on species like black swordfly or yellow mealworm indicates that factors such as stocking density, substrate quality, access to space for specific behavior can impact stress levels, mortality rates, and overall development. So for that, IPIF guidelines recommend optimizing stocking density, prevent crowding, ensure adequate resource access. We promote environmental enrichment, such as providing complex substrate that allow for natural burrowing or climbing behavior, which has been shown to improve welfare outcomes. With regard with stunning and slaughter, research is ongoing to identify the most humane and effective methods. Studies are evaluating the use of rapid temperature changes, like freezing or heat shock, and controlled atmosphere stunning to induce a lot of consciousness prior to slaughter with animal suffering. We advocate for the use of methods that are rapid and minimize distress. We emphasize the importance of standardizing this procedure across the industry to ensure they are applied consistently and effectively at commercial scale. Physiological needs and life cycle fulfillment. Of course, understanding species-specific needs is crucial. For example, ensuring appropriate light and dark cycle for crickets, or providing the correct condition for black soldier fly larvae to complete their natural pre-pupal wandering stage are areas of active research. Our guidance stresses the importance of replicating as much as possible the environmental conditions that allow for expression of natural behaviors to the insect life cycle, thereby reducing chronic stress. So just a few words on IPIF Guide on Good Hygiene Practice. This is the one we realized. We started in 2022 as a step forward on the ongoing work toward the EU Guide on Good Practice for the Welfare. More important than the fact sheet published in 2022, told you earlier, was the first to set EU-wide standards for good hygiene practices. This provides the basis for the development of an effective and well-implemented guide on good practice for insect welfare. It's important to underline the link between insect farming and production safety. Insect farming follows food and feed safety rules which apply to any other food and feed business operator. This is already established by the EU. The prime objective of the European insect sector is to produce safe inputs suitable for both human consumption and animal feed. So far in Europe, for human consumption, only mealworms is allowed. Against this background, in November 2016, the IPIF member decided to launch a task force on good hygiene principles, aimed at preparing and developing a guide on good hygiene practice for insect production. So the IPIF Guide on Good Hygiene Practices, who, why, what? Here you can see we drafted, it was drafted by IPIF members, consulted several EU representative organizations, and takes a year and several revisions since the time of the first draft. And we had 4 versions of the draft guide before coming to the final version. Then why? It was of EU effective application of EU food and feed safety regulation adapted to the insect production sector and provide practical tools for insect operators. Also, we want to promote to all the producer best hygiene practices and development shared standard within insect industry. And we cover hygiene practices in both insect as food and feed production and recommendation tailor-made for insect-based food and feed operator. This is how it was. The framework of the guide is based on applicable EU legislation for food and feed producers. It covers general requirements which can be followed by any business operator, followed by the insect-specific requirement. So you can see the general food law as an umbrella and all what we decline underneath with the 7th chapter. The guide furthermore combines all the diffracted legislative requirements into clear guidance. It also provides recommendations on production and processing method based on current industry practices. So we present here a general overview of the chapter from the guide. We cover the production of insect for human consumption or animal feed and encompass all production steps from the feeding of the insect, the breeding, the slaughtering, and other processing steps, storage, transport, or retail activity, to final delivery of the product to consumer, feed manufacturers, or farmers. The guide remains a voluntary document. Even after its validation as EU guide, it will not be mandatory. Yet those operators claiming to comply with the guide verified if they comply with it. The IPIF Guide on Good Hygiene Practices for Producers of Insect as Food and Feed was endorsed by ECPAF, the Committee on Biological Safety of the Food Chain, in October 2022, and Animal Nutrition on November 2024. The endorsement by this committee of our hygiene guide, due to its composition, translates in its approval on behalf of the European Union Commission and member states as a reference guide for the insect production at the EU level. This marks a significant step forward in ensuring robust hygiene standards for the growing insect production sector. As a science-backed industry, ensuring the highest possible safety standard is of utmost importance for IPIF and all members companies. So based on what we did with this hygiene guide, we want to work exactly the same way to establish our welfare guide. So you can consult the guide on good hygiene practice on your website, ipif.org, and you can even download it. So it's open to everyone. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have time for a couple of questions. I'll start with just one question about the Good Hygiene Guide. So does the Good Hygiene Guide have specific recommendations for producers about disease management in facilities? And if so, what are the kinds of recommendations that are made?
Yeah. So you want me to explain further in details about it?
Yeah, if you could explain some details about the kinds of recommendations made to producers about disease management and monitoring, that would be great.
Yeah, I would say we follow the EU rules developed for the safety, health and safety for other production, and we try to adapt. So what we do we have all the part in the farm following cleaning, washing, disinfection, this kind of thing we have to follow. Management of disease. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot, but in case it happens, it's recommended whether we have to empty the farm, clean it, and restart, or the way to fight against some disease. So this is kind of thing we develop in our hygiene guide. And also we are all the part from slaughter to dehydration and transformation in order to reach either a feed standard or food standard. So you can imagine when you go for food production, which is not developed really in Europe, but okay, we have the standards. It's a bit higher level to respect.
Great. And I know something else you talked about in the IPIF guide that is in development for welfare is a bit about providing guidance on what's already known. But then you also described, that we need a lot more research in this area. And so IPIF is calling for some more research to be done on insect welfare so we can have these science-backed guideline documents.
Yeah.
Does IPIF have any plans to help prioritize what the most important research to do would be? Because there's so much that you could do, but IPIF might have kind of special knowledge of the industry and what would be most important to do next.
Mm. So far, we don't have many institutional working on that, on welfare. So what is done is basically it's done by private producers themselves. And last for us, for instance, I could say, or example, when we are talking about the way to slaughter and kill animals, we develop a process and we show it to the French administration, and we ask them, okay, can you validate this is acceptable method respecting welfare? So although there is no really regulation on the way to kill larvae, the French administration had to give us an agreement, kind of letter saying, okay, we agree with your method of killing the larvae, and they stick to what they know for other animals. Okay.
So we have a question about the Guide on Good Hygiene Practices asking, does the Guide on Good Hygiene Practices recommend any food or feed safety and quality assurance standards that should be checked in the final products, like microbial load or toxin levels?
Yeah, we have some, when we have, for us, I would say, again, I take my example, so this is the one I know the best. When we have the final product, we have some, we take some sample and we go for microbiology analysis, and to release the product before it goes to the market, even in the feed, for the feed. Yeah.
And are there any industry or other collective organizations in Europe that are currently focused on trying to manage insect health and disease
For insect, you mean?
for insects?
No, I don't. To me, I don't. We have some program from EU working for insect disease, but mainly it's PhD student working on that. So, and they're followed by some professor, of course. But it's. I think there is about 10 to 12 people working on that in different universities in Europe. The one who are member of our organization as well.
And is that's the insect doctors program that you're referring
Yes,
to?
that's what I was mentioning to you earlier, the
Very
insect
cool.
doctors program.
We have a question here that might not be the most relevant for you to answer, but I can answer it. So this question is from Andrew about if the insect welfare protocols apply to the production of sterile New World screwworms. So those are not a problem in Europe, but we are having a problem in America with New World screwworm. And so I think what we would say is that while maybe IPIF wasn't creating these guidelines to intentionally to be used with New World screwworm, that welfare guidance on insects could be used in a general sense for kind of any species of insect, whether they are New World screwworms, silkworms, or black soldier fly or mealworms. So the general principle of these frameworks for animal welfare apply kind of irrespective of your context. Of course, as Benoit shared with us, there are going to be production specific variables that impact what you can and can't do with your particular production context. So for those of you familiar with how they make New World screwworms sterile, they tend to irradiate them. Generally, we wouldn't recommend irradiating animals as a high welfare practice.
Yeah,
However, it's a necessary part of this particular industry's operation because what they're trying to do is produce these sterile animals for the health and protection of other livestock animals in the US. So we can think welfare guidance can apply. We can think maybe not everything we do is the best for the animal's welfare, and we might still think that we have reason to do those things. Another question is about the black soldier fly industry in Europe. There's been some reductions in development, and they wondered if there were any comments that IPIF had on kind of the continued growth and success of the industry.
yeah. As you know, this production is quite new in Europe. I would say it's 10 years. So we had some progress. Of course, it's not, maybe you heard, but it's not always a constant growth like this. The industry is facing some up and down, but so far it's developing. We are acquiring know-how. But still, there is still a long way to go. I would say it's not. We are the good way, and the EU and some countries in EU, and I can say for France, a bit Germany, are also volunteering and trying to support our industry or to promote it and to develop it. But still, so we are on the way, but there is still a lot to do.
Great. And maybe one last question before we move on to our next speaker. Is the guidance that IPIF is generating on welfare standards species specific, or is it kind of more general? And I guess the same question for the hygiene guidelines.
Yeah, I think for welfare, for sure, it has to be species specific. Okay, there is some characteristic that could be common to all insects, but for some other, let's say if you talk about the, for instance, the light day and night or light and dark, it's all insect larvae do not need at the same needs. So it has to be adapted to each kind of insect. And we know for mealworms it's different than from BSF, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah, and that should make sense. I know a lot of us who aren't very familiar with insects might think all insects are kind of the same. But just like a chicken, a cow, and a pig are going to need different things from welfare perspectives.
Exactly.
So too are mealworms and black soldier flies different species. And in fact, you might even need different things across the life cycle. So your larval insects and your adult flies or adult beetles are not going to need the same things necessarily either. So
Exactly.
great that that's being
But I
taken.
think there will be a common the base. There will be a common base, and then we may have some different specificity depending
Yeah.
on species. Yeah, that's what we
Well,
want to do.
thank you so much, Benoit. I really appreciated your talk and getting to hear a little bit more about what IPIF is doing in this space. And I'm going to move us on to our next speaker, which is
Okay.
Benjamin Kennedy. He's an exotic and small animal veterinarian in the UK. He attended the Royal Veterinary College in London for his degree. He now has his own practice and he has years of experience working with invertebrate medicine. He also serves on the steering committee of the Veterinary Invertebrate Society, and I believe also spends some time working with the UK Edible Insect Association on production insects specifically. So, really excited to hear from him on some insights on insect farm medicine. And I'll turn it over to you, Benjamin.
Okay, hello everybody. Can you guys hear me? Just to confirm.
Yes.
Perfect. I will get started on this presentation then. So, one moment. So, I'm just here to talk to you about insect farm medicine and just a sort of more practical talk. I think this is a more principles-based talk. I don't really discuss case studies individually, but I do have various bits informed by different cases. So I think Megan's already beautifully introduced me, but this is me. I run InvertiVet, which is a business tailored to invertebrate medicine, and I'm obviously part of the steering committee of the Veterinary Invertebrate Society. So just to set the scene here, so I think there is a historical context to insect keeping and to farm medicine of insects, and I think there certainly is some literature support for that. But modern insect farming is quite new from the veterinary perspective, and I think veterinary involvement is quite new. It is an often missed animal group when it comes to veterinary cover, but this space is moving really fast. Some of the panelists in this sort of online webinar seminar will demonstrate, I'm sure. I'm going to start with a very bird's eye view and then go further and further down into the practical. And what I'm presenting here is my approach, and I'm not going to claim to have all the answers. And I'm sort of speaking from the perspective of a vet that I do primarily exotic medicine and small animals, dogs and cats, and I do invertebrates, and certainly in my country, in the UK, there's not many vets that do invertebrates at all. And even beekeeping and bee medicine is quite detached from the veterinary world in the UK. This is much less so in Europe. So I'm beginning to see some farmed insect clients, and this presentation has sort of come from that. So it's more on the fields, more down in the trenches rather than quite high level. So, I mean, I want to just start with this slide, which is just a whole presentation of different insects that are farmed. I think, the previous presentation beautifully illustrated that, it's mostly black soldier fly. Oh. It's mostly black soldier fly, and it's mealworm, but actually there's loads and loads of other invertebrates that are farmed. We've got oysters here from a French oyster farm. This one here is butterfly pupa in a zoo being used to exhibit butterflies. So and then these are internationally traded and farmed. These in particular were delivered in and imported in from Africa. So, and then we've got all of our aquatic invertebrates as well. And we have also got our science, academia-based mosquitoes being reared, and Drosophila, which I think every biology student will be familiar with at some point. So there's definitely a lot of insect farming that's outside of what we're aware of, sort of in terms of we are focusing on edible, but actually in reality, there's a huge amount of invertebrate species that are reared. And the history of these species being reared is quite long. So I think we can have a tendency sometimes to concentrate on this very new world where actually there's a lot of principles that are already there that that can be applied to what we already know. So, insect farming, invertebrate farming is primarily black soldier fly and mealworms. I think several cricket species in the UK are definitely reared for food as well. I think that what the system is and the scale of the farm really depends on what the intention is. Now, I think some black soldier fly facilities can be massive, huge farms, and I'm sure they will get bigger and bigger and bigger. But obviously, there are other levels of insect rearing as well, where veterinary medicine becomes involved. So, for example, I've worked with scorpion and spider collections where the end product is venom that's being milked for use in research. I've also come across systems where maggots are being produced not for research but purely to be used in healthcare for decontaminating wounds, and they have to be utilized in a certain way. And leeches, of course, are also farmed for use in leech therapy. So there are lots of specialist and more bespoke production systems beyond what we're aware of. And obviously those systems also have health problems as well. So there's a lot of lessons and a lot of information, a lot of data out there. But I think the thing is, at the moment, there's a lot of variability. So there certainly are some small holdings. I certainly have had clients in the past that have had quite small operations, which are more bespoke, from all the way through to huge warehouses that have been beautifully demonstrated in the previous presentation. So why does disease and health matter? So I think ultimately we're not really rewriting the book here. I think good health drives good production. I think the previous presenter beautifully illustrated that. He discussed that actually good welfare and good production outcomes normally come hand in hand. And I think part of good health is having good disease control, surveillance, and being aware of mass mortality to prevent that mass mortality. I think healthier insects provide better yields with lower quality nutrition. So if we're managing health, then we're able to utilize these animals in the way that we want to utilize them, because obviously we're trying to get black soldier fly and other insects to take on lower quality food sources that may not be appropriate for other livestock. I guess it's also important to state, and one of the questions stated about microbial testing, microbial burden, these animals are being culled and potentially entering into the food chain, be that the human food chain or the animal food chain. And actually them being healthy means they're more likely to have a lower level of microbial load. So I guess the other thing to say here is currently we have because of the timings and the way that we put these animals through their life cycle, which can be as low as 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the species, that's a very quick turnover. But it does mean that if you have a supply chain, if you have an end client that needs X amount of protein and you have an issue with your system, you don't always have the option of burning everything down and then rebuilding. So this is where the role of treatment could potentially come in, to try and manage that and to try and ensure that you are securing your food chain and your supply chain. So what does disease look like? Now, this is a great section of images from this paper, co-authored by one of the panelists, actually, and it's a fantastic paper. I really would recommend reading through it. But it looks in insects, it's primarily things like behavioral change. So I often see a reduction in feeding behaviours or lethargy, more quiet. It's almost, you sort of want to discuss things with a stockman, does stockman of any livestock. Physical exam, you will see sometimes discoloration, you'll have melanisation and redness, bacterial disease, so Serratia marcescens in particular. You might see deformities, bloating or molting issues. So you're almost seeing the consequences of disease. I think the other thing is mortality spikes or slower growth, perhaps insects not molting or going through into the next instar as successfully, and also a reduction in egg laying. So you might see disease not in your production insects, but potentially in your breeding stock that you're using to produce the production insects. So, this is sort of my experience of what disease looks like in insects. And just to show you some practical slides, we have here on the right, so a locust from a collection that wanted to get my advice with quite significant fungal disease. In this particular case, due to an inappropriate level of humidity. And then we have gregarian parasites here. So these things, which are essentially endoparasites within another locust population. Again, these gregarian parasites can be present in multiple different insects. And this is an image demonstrating what those gregarian parasites look like in the midgut of one of these S. gregaria insects. So, this is an interesting case because the levels of S. gregaria in this population reached 16,000 per gram of intestine, which is an impressive burden. And even when this case was well controlled, the gregarian didn't disappear. It was still present, just at much lower numbers. Again, this is another example. So we have just a domesticus, classic field cricket. On the left, we have these quite melanized insects, and on the right, we have comparatively less melanized insects. And the presented clinical signs was reduction in production. So, these animals weren't as productive, not growing as quickly, and that they had all become quite melanized. And essentially, we got this image. This is the fat body. Now, if we go back and we look at this organ here, this is fat body in a locust. Obviously, not the same species, but this is what it should look like. Somewhat, obviously, diseased insect as well. This is what the fat body looked in this insect. So, essentially, this huge amount of proteinaceous material present within the fat body. I felt that this was heat shock protein because it turned out that the ventilation systems in this particular farm hadn't worked, and there'd been a massive spike in temperature. So what you're seeing here is a response to that shock. So again, it shows you how these insects can display disease in different ways. And I think this slide is very interesting as well. So this is horsehair worms, nematode morpha, I think, in a cricket species. But what's interesting is this animal, these are all little follicles that will produce eggs eventually, with these cross sections of an endoparasite basically taking up the entire animal. Again, illustrating just how much of a burden these animals can have, which then sort of brings me on to my next slide. What is health for an insect? I think when we think of health and livestock, I think we're thinking in a vertebrate way. And vertebrates obviously have a very different strategy and a very different mechanism for how they deal with disease, particularly pathogen-related disease. So, if I get a bacterial infection, my adaptive immune response will try and manage and mitigate. It might change my temperature. It might, begin to destroy cells which have high levels of the bacteria involved, produce pus. So there's an adaptive immune response there. And ultimately, my body will attempt to get rid of that bacterial infection or viral load or whatever. As insects don't have that system. They have a different strategy where they have a more directed innate immune response to manage the burden. So that means that there isn't necessarily the same process of clearing a pathogen in the same way. And we have to also bear in mind black soldier fly, mealworms, both adapted for large environmental burden of microorganisms. So their systems are geared up to deal with pathogens. You know, they're acting and they're surviving despite a load, not because they're clearing a load. And it's a really important distinction to make about these animals. So, you know, high levels of parasitism can be associated with normal. So this animal wasn't, you look at how much, about 30–40% of this animal's volume was being taken up by this parasite. They weren't behaving differently. They were still reproductively active. And there's a lesson here to be learned, which is, you know, microbiological burden can be a variation of normal. You know, high levels of parasitism can be tolerated without necessarily showing obvious clinical signs. You will see a difference in production. So I think when you consider health management, it's about managing the health of the insect and managing the different disease processes and pathogens and burdens that insect is going under to try and enable good production. And again, it's very easy, I think, for us to put a lot of emphasis on microbiological agents. So, for example, if you find a virus and you had a mass die-off of your insects, does that mean that virus is the cause, or is it actually that insect has been dealing with that virus for a very long time? And actually, overall, its husbandry management is what's essentially precluded that virus from being able to overgrow in the way it has and the disease process from occurring. It becomes a very chicken and egg situation here. So, you know, and what diseases are we talking about? I think viral diseases very popularly, very well known, well established in both Europe and the States is desnovirus in crickets. I think Serratia marcescens has been associated with lots of different farmed insects and zoological insects. I've got Candida species for fungal disease, but I've also seen aspergillosis, lots of different parasites and endoparasites. And I think there's probably more than we actually think there is or realize. I think we have to go looking for it. I think nutritional disease definitely happens. I think if we give these animals a prolonged period of poor nutrition, or nutrition that isn't necessarily appropriate for that animal, then we will see immunosuppression and eventually disease. It doesn't necessarily have that dramatic appearance of everything dies off, but I think it certainly has the appearance of reduced productivity, reduced fecundity. And again, genetic disease, I think, is something that we're still having to fully digest, because a lot of the species that are kept for production are very different from wild type. I think we have brought in a load of these different species into captivity, and we have started to adapt them for captivity. I mean, locust species in particular are very classical for that. They are adapted to have nothing but food and to grow 24-hour, 7 days a week. And actually in the wild, they don't have the same behaviors or productivity. So again, we also have predation, which is very dependent on your system as to how, whether your system is fully open or closed. So, and the challenges for me, so these are challenges I've definitely seen. I think there are centuries of livestock experience, but it's geared up for mammals and birds, but not really geared up for insect farming. And I think the same principles do apply, but I think they have to be adapted quite extremely. There are a few vets with specialist training, especially in the UK. I think there are more and more of them. I imagine in Europe this may not be the case, or in the States. I would say, another weakness that I've seen is primarily the interest is academic, i.e. academics are interested, and that's really, really good. However, I think if you have an insect farm with an active problem, you often don't have weeks or months. or years, you have days. And I have seen where, say we have unknown virus X or we have a burden and we're trying to figure that out quickly. I sometimes find the academic model doesn't always work well. And this is where a clinical model does. I think the other issue we have is there are a whole level of disease X. I think there are lots of unknowns for what diseases these animals get that we're still learning today. So we can have unexpected outbreaks or mass die-offs, and there isn't necessarily a beautiful answer as to why that's happened. So I think it requires a much more holistic approach. So, and certainly from the diagnosis point of view, rapid diagnosis, I think I bring my centrifuge and my microscope to farms and I start doing things there and then. I find histology in particular is very, very good. I really find histology quite helpful, certainly of different instars. I find, just before the final instar is a good instar to start with. But microbiology, squash preps, these can all be microscopy, squash preps can be done on site. So you can often get an idea of parasite burden very rapidly, and to just get an idea of, you're not necessarily using parasite burden to establish, is there a parasite burden? You're often using parasite burden to establish, is there something that's causing this population to be overpopulated? So it's a chicken and egg conversation. And again, we do have things like PCR. However, they have some limitations. So for instance, if you want to look for desnovirus within a cricket farm, you have a primer. It's relatively specific, but you're only really going to find desnovirus or not find desnovirus. It's not necessarily going to give you the clues for all the other things that may or may not be occurring. And I still think our knowledge base has a lot to go. There are no real standardized diagnostic algorithms that's really available. I think it's being developed, and I think it's definitely having massive leaps forward, but I think we still have a lot of things to learn. I certainly think there's also a place for good stockmanship. I think ideally a vet shouldn't get involved because a stockman should be aware of the problems and trying to mitigate it before it happens. And I think these are already in place in a lot of farms, but not universally. I think sometimes we miss the wood for the trees with these animals. So we have a problem. What do we do about it? I think from a veterinary perspective, one of the values of vets is the capacity to give veterinary medications. And I do think this space will develop over the next 5 to 10 years because it will have to. What drugs could be effective? Obviously, a lot of what we're trying to do is direct management change and inform farmers of what the problems are so they can try and change the management and husbandry to address those problems. So we have the issue of how we administer drugs to these animals, because obviously trying to administer drugs to a bunch of cows is very different from trying to administer drugs to millions of insects. And it's then determining treatment success. And we also have this issue of withdrawal periods and drug residues. So, there are some things that are licensed for insects. So, Amatraz, Apivar, French product, great product, works in Varroa in bees. And it's a great ectoparasite treatment in lots of different invertebrates. It's very helpful. And you also have oxalic acid, which is very similar. We do have things like oxytetracycline that have been established in honeybees and lobsters. I've certainly used it in zoological medicine. Would it be appropriate in a farm animal context? Probably not. I think we're trying to move away from antibiotic use, but it certainly is present. And certainly if you had a breeding population that was there to produce eggs, would there be a justification for it? I think that's a whole conversation. But certainly in the UK, we have to work with the cascade. And this is where I think the lack of data for specific species is a real barrier for entry for trying to treat these animals. The standard withdrawal period is 28 days for drugs that are off cascade in the UK. I'm not aware of what exactly is in the States or in Europe. I guess the other issue, and I've certainly had this, is, again, this is a great paper looking at gregarin, but one of the issues is one of the drugs that was found to be effective was metronidazole, and metronidazole is rather banned in food-producing animals because it's carcinogenic. So there's a whole series of drugs which are banned in food-producing animals, but obviously within academic settings, we may use all sorts of wonderful drugs, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a drug that can be used in a industrial farming context. So there's lots of problems. I think there's lots of barriers. This isn't me saying that we need to be jumping on medicine straight away, but it is me sort of discussing the practical problems. Again, is how do we even administer? This is where we have to start taking. I think we like to pretend that this is a very new industry, but in some respects it really isn't. Fish medicine has lots of analogues and lots of similarities to insect medicine, and in that world we treat based on biomass, and this is certainly how I felt and how I'm starting to find that we can begin to approach medicating insects. But we have a lot of unknowns, so we need to know what an average rate of feeding is. So we need to know what does species insect eat over 24 hours per kilo of biomass of that insect, and that data for a lot of insect species just isn't there. But we can, if we have that, we can begin to infer these things. We can begin to go, okay, we have so many kilos of insect. This kiloage of insect eats this amount of food. We want to dose these insects per kilo, so we give this dose based on that amount of food. But then you have the challenge of how do you mix and compound that medication into that food such that these animals will eat a known dose. So it's doable. I just think it is quite challenging because a lot of the data just isn't there at the moment. And then we have to deal with the practicals of withdrawal periods. So, on cascade we have 28 days, but that's based on very little. I find obviously we want to try and avoid using any medications. If you have a population of animals which is being farmed but not for consumption, this becomes more viable because the concerns of human consumption go down. But the issue is we don't really have the data to tell us, okay, what is the mean residual limit? After 28 days, are these drugs well out the system and not there, or are they still in the system? We don't really have the data, but I think this is going to come because I think there is a economic reason for it to come. So there's a lot here that we still need to learn. Again, I'd be happy to be corrected by the panelists or anybody in the audience. And then how do we even determine treatment success? Because our problem is we're not necessarily wiping out pathogens. We're sometimes bringing pathogens down to a point where the population can survive by itself, or we're sometimes using treatments to try and mitigate and manage known pathogens within a population that you will never truly get rid of. So ideally, whenever you're using any treatment, and I think pretty much every treatment at this point has an unknown use because I think there's very little that has been established. You have to do it on a trial population first, and you see if that trial population is still alive and well after the trial. And we need to be using diagnostic tests, ideally ones which are quantitative, such that we can establish, okay, what is the bacterial load versus viral load versus parasite load, and is that actually changing with treatment? And are there any obvious changes to production? Again, this is where a stocksman can be very, very helpful, because I think a stocksman that's being quite objective and knows their animals will sometimes be able to tell you if your management is making a difference or your treatment is making a difference. So I guess this is the other dimension also to insect production, in that I think at the moment I'm finding certainly in the UK there's a bit of a mismatch. So again, this is such an obvious statement. I feel almost stupid saying it, but insect production is a commodity market. We are producing a product from an input, and there may be some level of IP or some level of tech in how you make those insects grow or how you slaughter those insects or what sort of input you're giving them, but ultimately you're producing an end product. And I think currently the market is very dominated by tech-orientated investment. And I'm not sure that approach lends itself to a commodity market, to be honest. Like, I don't think you can move fast and break things, which is maybe why we had that little question about, changes of investment. I think actually the approach to make this industry work, we probably do actually have an awful lot that we could learn from other livestock industries, because actually it's a far more long-term approach. And does this current investment environment lend itself to the health focus or welfare focus? I think it does, but I do think it does add some potential issues. Again, slight tangent, but just something I wanted to put in a slide. And then biosecurity. Again, I suspect I'm teaching a lot of you to suck eggs, but this I find is one of the big issues. Again, said previous conversation about viral diseases occurring within a population. If you don't have that viral disease in that population, you've got to be very protective. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from the poultry industry. Ideally, production stock and breeding stock should be separated, not kept on the same site or in the same building or in a situation where staff are dealing with one and then the other. Ideally, they should be completely separated. I think quarantine is incredibly important, and I think in these animals it should be several generations. So it's not time; it's generations. If you're bringing a new source of insects, it should be ideally put through 2 generations, I think, as a minimum. Batches should be separate, and they should be dealt with from clean to dirty. So ideally, that can take the form of young stock to old stock, or it can take the form of high risk to low risk. So again, appropriate disinfection. I think staff education and how staff manage these animals is really important. Again, and visitors and monitoring of who's coming in and where disease vectors are is really important. Again, just lessons learned. I think insect health and farm success are linked. I think there is potential for veterinary inputs to improve production and welfare, but I think it's still in its infancy. And I think good biosecurity and husbandry remain the most powerful tools. And I think there's an awful lot we still need to learn. So just some references and acknowledgements. So Veterinary Vertebrate Society and some pathologists that they've been very helpful, as well as my wife. Do we have enough time for questions?
Unfortunately, no time for questions at this moment, but Benjamin will be on for the panel later, I believe. Is that right, Benjamin?
Yep.
And we will have lots of time for those questions then. I did just want, for the one question about the names of the manuscripts you recommend we read, that'll be Dr. Eilenberg's group, who will be presenting later today. He has several papers out of his group on insect disease, and so highly recommend you check those out. But we will move on now to our next presenter. So that is going to be Dr. Judith Penzes. Judith is an assistant professor at Texas A&M in the Department of Entomology, and she is a specialist in viral diseases in insects. And so I will turn things over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm just trying to share my screen. Yeah, there we go. Come on. All right. You see my screen, right?
All good.
Okay, perfect. Oh, come on. Just want to get the pointer for this, but it's not that important. Anyway, so thank you for inviting me to give this talk in here at the first iteration of this initiative. This is really exciting, and I really hope there will be more to come, because this is an important topic to talk about. So this talk will be about cricket viruses, and as such, why is it important to talk about viruses of crickets? Well, as Benjamin has already said a lot about insect farming and its diseases, crickets are especially important as being one of the most widely farmed insects, which are farmed for nutritional purposes. Apart from this, crickets are also members of the order Orthoptera, which is an extremely diverse cosmopolite insect order, and many of the members are significant from agricultural and ecological point of view as well. The viral pathogens have been extremely significant in the cricket rearing industry up until now, because they basically shaped how the industry itself has formed. And in this process, one of the most significant representatives are actually densoviruses, out of which Acheta domesticus densovirus stands out as like one of the most significant cricket pathogen to this date. But actually, we have discovered another highly pathogenic densovirus, Acheta domesticus segmented densovirus, which has symptoms really similar to ADDV, starting with this ascending paralysis at the hind limbs of the insect. Apart from this, there are other viral lineages that are significant, such as invertebrate iridoviruses, cross-DNA viruses of crickets, and even other densoviruses. However, the significance of these are a little less understood, but ADDV was definitely a major point of why the industry is slowly in the United States moving away from farming Acheta domesticus. Cricket viruses are one of the most investigated invertebrate viruses among insects that are farmed for nutritional purposes, but still, are only these viruses the ones that are out there, or is there more to it? We still, even though we know ADDV quite well, and all the other viruses I mentioned, we still see that crickets die really quite frequently. Many of them, as these pictures are a testament to it, actually die in transit, whereas they come from otherwise healthy farms, or just simply a colony that has been doing completely fine all of a sudden collapses and dies off. So all of these pictures come from a very quick social media search, actually, just by asking the question, why did my crickets die? Currently, viral infections and their origins are mostly investigated and discovered by using a metagenomics approach. And unfortunately, this approach, though it has revolutionized virus discovery, is not without its pitfalls, as demonstrated by the figure on this slide. So this figure shows how many of each viral taxa have been classified in every single year by have been classified every single year by the International Committee on the Taxonomy of Viruses, or ICTV. And as you can see, the classification of smaller taxa, such as species and genera, have exploded basically following the explosion of metagenomics-driven virus discovery. However, the same trend is not quite true for higher level taxa, such as viral families and orders, and let alone even higher ones. So this demonstrates the pitfalls of metagenomics, as in the identification of novel viruses with a metagenomic approach relies exclusively on homology search, which means if we don't have a pre-established database, there isn't really an easy way to tell about sequence, whether if it's of viral origin or not. Also, this approach uses target genomes in order to assemble new viral sequences. So de novo assembly can be really challenging to do, especially in case of viruses with segmented genomes or highly divergent viral genomes. So what could be an alternative to a metagenomic approach? Well, a couple of years ago, I had an idea that we use electron microscope micrographs so frequently to diagnose viral illnesses without any nucleic acid biology involved in the process. And indeed, these 3 micrographs on this slide were actually all used to diagnose viral illnesses. 2 of these are from my 6-legged patients of mystery die-offs at cricket farms. One was an invertebrate iridovirus infection. The other one was actually a Heta domesticus segmented densovirus. And the third one, however, is a human case, and it is the very micrograph that was used to establish that the coronavirus was behind the original SARS coronavirus epidemic. So we were asking the question that if we can use these micrographs, can we take it actually one step further and use cryo-electron microscopy to actually reconstruct the structure of virus particles for identification purposes? And actually, this process has been implemented successfully because last year we published this paper in Cell where we used this methodology to diagnose what was the mystery causative agent behind a nationwide epidemic in superworms in the United States. And because of this, we could implement disinfection protocols that actually saved quite a lot of farms. So it was really satisfactory to see that this discovery was a success story. But what is cryotransmission electron microscopy, or cryo-EM? So we start with a small so-called electron microscope grid, which is a microscope grid, which is actually a very fine match supporting a wholly support film that is hydrophobic, which we make hydrophilic by supercharging it with plasma irradiation, and then load the sample on the surface, just a couple of microliters of this grid, where we blot away the excess and then plunge it into usually liquid ethane, but it can be any other type of cryogen. So what we end up with is that our protein of interest will be suspended in this thin amorphous ice in the holes on the support film, which we can then bombard with electron beams and take these electron beams when they pass their sample with a direct electron detector. And then from these micrographs, we can select the particles we are interested in. We can align their projections first in 2 dimensions, and then we can regenerate basically a 3-dimensional structure of it at near atomic resolution. And then these electron silhouettes can be actually modeled to the atomic level. So we came across a case when at the Canadian cricket farm, some of these Canadian cricket farm, there was a big die-off, and the symptoms were actually consistent with Heta domesticus segmented densovirus, and the farm had a history of this illness. So basically, the animals were completely paralyzed, lying on their back before they died. But when we tried PCR testing, none of these animals actually turned out to be positive for any of the known cricket viruses. So what we did was that we subjected a few animals for gradient density gradient virus purification, where we did get a really decent protein containing fraction at the 50% interface. However, when we visualized this with the cryo-electron microscope, what we saw were these tiny particles at 18 nanometers, which is literally the smallest virus particle that we know is in existence. As you can see, it actually co-purifies with ferritin. That's how small they were. And then they consisted of multiple protein fractions. So we resolved the 3D structure of this mystery virus, which was a T+1 icosahedron and had actually quite a decent amount of density inside the particle, which we attributed to be of the viral genome. But who is this virus exactly? So in order to find out, we isolated an asymmetric unit of this icosahedron and then built, as you can see, this silhouettes, that is our electron density map. We could build an atomic model into it, trying to explain these silhouettes the best we could. Well, actually, a program does it for us, so we didn't even have to do it manually. But the shape of these silhouettes, which amino acid side chain could explain it the best. And by doing this process for the entire asymmetric unit, we ended up with this single asymmetric unit structure, using which we could, in the end, model the entire viral particle. But we still entire viral particle, and to our surprise, what we saw was that there were actually two protein chains per asymmetric unit. As you can see, one in the dark blue, a small one, and the larger one with the light blue. To find out whom this structure belongs to, we first used the structural comparison method with a program called Dolly, where we just took this structure and compared it to all resolved protein structures thus far in the protein data bank. However, this comparison, even though it yielded some virus capsid hits, was not significant. Basically, from this data, if we didn't know that our protein came from a virus, we could not be able to tell whether this is a virus or not. So we continued with the sequence because, as you remember, we could basically get the protein sequence of this structural protein just by building this atomic model. So we could perform an CIBI blast search, which did not come back with any results whatsoever. Then a search with HH-Blitz, which is more sensitive to the lack of homology, and then to the lack of homology, and this one was also not returning anything significant. So now we had no other choice but to sequence the actual nucleic acid itself. So I didn't want to sequence any kind of nucleic acid that ever existed, so we had to limit this problem. And to do so, we looked at the actual structure and looked at this density inside the virus particle, which forms these concentric circles, which suggest some degree of intrinsic ordering, but doesn't show any spools of double-stranded nucleic acid. So we knew that our nucleic acid is going to be single-stranded and most likely RNA, because single-stranded DNA is a lot more disordered than this. So we performed a very basic Illumina sequencing from $80, including shipping, to get this viral genome on cDNA in the end. And to our surprise, however, we didn't just get one genome. There were actually 6 molecules with equal sequence coverage, approximately at 2 kilobases of length, and they all encoded a single open reading frame. However, all of these were kept and had the same secondary structure at the 5' end, and they all had polyadenylation tails, which suggested to us that these were actually 6 segments of the same genome, and because of the caps and poly A tail, it was a positive single-stranded RNA. But what do these? So we knew that this was an RNA virus, and since all RNA viruses share a single hallmark gene called the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, we embarked on a journey to actually find this polymerase among the 6 segments, because none of these segments gave any hits with a simple BLAST-P search. In the end, we located the RDRP to this third segment, and how we did it was actually an iterative process using PSI BLAST, which in the end yielded the relatives of this virus, which all were actually from a putative virus family called the Quonyaviridae. But why is the Quonyaviridae a putative virus family? Well, it's because these viruses were identified as just stray RNA-dependent RNA polymerases inside the Drosophila metagenome dark matter. What this means is that in a metagenome, sometimes even as much as half of the sequences, or not even more, cannot be linked to anything that we currently have in the gene bank, so we designate this as unidentifiable dark matter. Well, in 2020, Darren Obard and his team actually identified this really peculiar, highly divergent RNA viruses in this dark matter, but nobody has ever seen a quoniovirus before or linked any pathology to their existence. So they, as co-occurring with this RDRP, in the end identified the presence of 5 segments in these viruses and named all of them in the language of the High Elves in Tolkien's Lord of Rings saga by names that express this uncertainty, such as maybe and perhaps. And by this method, they could identify the putative genome of 37 viruses in this potential family. So we jumped upon the bandwagon and actually named this new virus virus, which means confirmed in Quonia, because now we actually had a pathogenesis as well, a pathology associated with the Quonia virus, and even a 3-dimensional capsid structure. So next, we were curious whether other quonioviruses were out there, since the other 5 segments of virus had no homologous relatives whatsoever inside the gene bank or even among other quonioviruses. And indeed, we could in the end identify novel quonioviruses, further novel quonioviruses in spider metagenomes, as well as in other insect metagenomes such as beetles and snakeflies, and even in marine corals and sponges. And indeed, when doing a phylogenetic reconstruction of the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, we could show that our new quonioviruses formed a sister group to the original quonioviruses detected by Darren Obard's team. So what can we know about these other segments? Well, we could only associate some function with segment 6 next, which actually harbored a transmembrane helix, which we could confirm with multiple software, and a function analysis suggested ATP catabolysis as well as transport as its functions. What we suspect is that this segment encodes actually a transmembrane channel. And the next segment we learned anything about, the other 3 are still a mystery what they might encode, is segment 2, which we could easily identify as our structure of protein, since we had the amino acid sequence from the structure of the capsid protein. But what was interesting is that actually our 2 capsid proteins were both could both be correlated to the protein encoded by segment 2. And when we did a protein sequencing with tandem mass spectrometry, excising these protein-GL bands, we could also show that this entire segment 2 protein was actually, in fact, present in the structure protein of this virus, and only two of these many proteins were associated with this virus, and none of the other segments could be correlated with any of these proteins. These two structure proteins were, however, both leaky scanned versions translated from the two different methionines of segment 2. So the capsid only contains segment 2, and that's the only structure protein that this virus has. But now you might ask, where did this entire missing domain go? Well, we knew it wasn't disordered because disorder predictions in silico did not show it to have any type of disorder whatsoever. So to find the missing spike domain, I actually looked at these 2D averages where you can see that there is a halo type of formation of electron density around the capsid itself. And if we take these micrographs at high defocus, which means we aren't very close to focus, like as if you were trying to look at something with a little bit of a cross eye. This gives us a lot more contrast in electron microscopy. We could see that the particle was surrounded by these mushroom-like protrusions. And then I'm not going to go into details how I did it, but I did a lot of iterative local and global search, which then yielded me some density around this capsid, which I could then relax the symmetry and actually obtain the real form of ANVA virus. So it does indeed have spikes around the threefold symmetry axis, which is a very unusual capsid morphology, and something similar has only been seen in single-stranded DNA virus bacteriophages, but never in an RNA virus. So another feature that we learned about this virus, looking at the structure, was that as you can see when we look inside the capsid itself, some of these interfaces are actually very weak hydrophobic interfaces. This we could also confirm by an energetic analysis where we could show that it is indeed very little free energy that forms when these hydrophobic interfaces come together during assembly. So what this told us was that actually we could denature this virus by simple surfactants. We don't need to use bleach or ethanol or any more serious disinfectant. We could just scrape the surfaces really, really well with soap and water, and that should actually do the trick. So yeah, I forgot that I had these arrows. So what we learned from the story of ANVA virus was that, first of all, there are way more viruses out there in common house crickets than what we previously thought, and that these viruses can mask in pathology. Just because you see a similar pathology, that doesn't mean it's the same culprit in the background. And it's significant to know actually what you're facing with, because you can select the proper disinfecting agent to deal with your viral infection. Also, we could show that cryotransmission electron microscopy can extend our diagnostic horizon quite a bit, because there are viruses out there that we don't have PCR systems for, and ANVA virus could have never been discovered by a standard pathogenomic approach for two reasons. It's really divergent. A simple blast search would never find this virus for you. And second, it has a segmented genome, which would have been difficult to would have been difficult to assemble when you're not sequencing purified virus with a targeted nucleic acid, but just grinding all your crickets and do metagenomics, do a metagenomic sequencing on them, and this, I think this is a really neat study showing how cryo-EM can be a really big contribution to how we can further develop insect diagnostics and virus discovery. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and for my team at Texas A&M, we just got started, but there's more to come as far as cryo-EM and insect viruses. No.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Those are very tiny viral particles.
They indeed are.
Yeah, really
Smallest.
cool. So a couple of questions for you since we have just a minute here. So I was wondering, what is the host tropism of this group of viruses that you've sort of discovered? So are these viruses really specific to a single species of insects, or do you think they have a broader host range than that?
So they seem to have a really broad host range. So the ones that we found in the spider metagenomes are actually extremely similar to this virus. Once we are going to get there, that we are going to classify these viruses by the ICTV, they will definitely be members of the same species. So what is really interesting about this virus is that we have a pathology which we could repeat by re-injecting the particles into healthy crickets, and then apparently this virus could come anywhere. Just imagine such an innocent thing happening, that a spider crawls into your cricket farm and spreading these viruses. So apparently threats can come from multiple directions, and it's not only insects we are looking at, but other arthropods as well. I don't know about how much we can trust the coral and sponge data, because these are filter feeders. So it can be that these viruses infect other marine invertebrates, and just because of high viral yields, particles get into these filter feeding organisms too.
Great. And another question, how do you measure the energy of interactions within a virus?
So this can be done by multiple softwares that are here. They basically analyze the interactions between the amino acids. You can mark up the interfaces which you are curious of, but the program is quite intelligent in finding these. You basically just have to feed them with a trimer, a pentamer, and a dimer separately. So it's really just boils down to how these amino acids interact with each other, and we know that these type of non-covalent interactions, what kind of free energy they require in order to form, so we can model these and then calculate the actual amount of free energy that we are dealing with. It's very, very low what you saw in here. In like parvoviruses and densoviruses, it's at least one log higher. So it is indeed little capsid that is designed to fall apart at the right time, which we also know when it happens, and I have some cool data on that, but that's the topic of another presentation, I believe.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We're going to move on to our next presenter. We'll ask more questions of you when it comes to the panel discussion at the end. So I'm going to next introduce Dr. Göran Eilenberg, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Copenhagen. He has worked on a variety of insect diseases and has focused especially on insects farmed as food and feed. And in fact, his work has already been referenced in other talks today because he is a very prominent figure in this field. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eilenberg. If you would like to share your slides, we are excited for your talk.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and I know you cannot see me because somehow my camera and all this setup didn't work. It worked when we tested it, but not today. So you have to find a photo of me on the web if you wish. Anyway, oops, what happened? Oops, share my oops, presentation. So, can you see my slides?
We sure can.
You can?
Yep, all good.
Good. Now let me get this done here. Talking me, oops. Yeah, I was asked to speak about some of my own experience and also pay a little attention to black soldier fly, which I have done. Gave me a good opportunity to read through a couple of papers produced by other people during the last couple of years. I've been involved with Insect Doctors Program, invaluable healthy insects, green insects in Africa, both, and several other projects of this kind. And as mentioned, I'm emeritus professor at University of Copenhagen. I have retired since almost 3 years, but the group is there, so things are going nicely on. I've studied insect pathogens for decades, basic studies, biological control, diseases in production insects. The latter, the production insect thing was sparked, my interest was sparked around 2010-12 in relation to really the start of producing insects for food and feed. And yeah, then I've served the Society for Invertebrate Pathology. In the very most recent years, I've organized online courses for World Bank on insect diseases in production insects in Zimbabwe and Uganda. So I have done that, and also I've been mentor and training and graduation coordinator for the 15 PhD students in the EU program Insect Doctors. And I will just say here that these 15 students, they did a fantastic job, and the results are really remarkable. So they did a good job, these 15. Now, maybe this is obvious to you and you know it already, but it's always good to keep in mind that we have these hemimetabolous insects where nymphs and adults, they stay at the same places, they have the same diet, and horizontal transmission can take place between individuals in the same instar, and basically also, of course, vertical transmission. But anyway, they are at the same places, adults and nymphs. And then we have black soldier fly on the right. It is a holometabolous insect where larvae and adults are basically two completely different organisms. In many cases, they do not share pathogens, holometabolous insects, because of that. And some characteristics of important groups of insect pathogens. We speak about the infection route. Or for virus, it's oral or vertical. And viruses are, as said also by Judith before, generally they are specialists. Bacteria, oral infection route. There can also be others, for example, through wounds, but some species are generalists, some other specialists. And fungi, mostly through cuticle or oral. Some species are generalists, other are specialists. Microsporidia, oral, and they are specialists. And nematodes through body openings, and they are generalists. Yeah, this is just to say my own interest in insect pathogens. This is a fantastic, big, mostly unexplored world of wonderful biodiversity. New species, new genotypes, new interactions discovered each year, as we also heard earlier today. In my own case, I have the pleasure of having described 8 new species of the fantastic fungus genus Strongwellsia over the latest few years. They infected flies, a big abdominal hole develops from where spores, the conidia, are discharged like small rockets while the fly is still alive. Fantastic dispersal mechanism. And then it's fun to also to find new things, give it in Latin names and all this. Okay, but going back to the production insects, the typical situation, there's, in this case, it's tenebrio. What is wrong? Some did get discolored, some die. Is it an insect disease or some saprophytic microorganisms, and any action needed? Now, this is a basic question we could ask 10 years ago, and we can still ask it because the diagnosis, external diagnosis on symptoms and causative organisms is a challenge after all. In this case here, this is an unknown bacterium, a fungus, and a nematode which infected the poor mealworms. Now, we made in 2015 this overview paper, Diseases in Insects Produced for Food and Feed. And it was interesting to do it at that time because there was, in many instances, not that much knowledge. But then we tried to compile what we could find and, for example, compare with what has happened to some of the more known production insects. For example, Bombyx mowii. There are some virus being discovered now and then. This year, our study ended in around 2012, literature study. And in all cases here, then it started with the point that people found infected larvae with symptoms. And then from there on, then they determined or described the virus. I'm aware that in the latest year, then all the molecular methods have potentially giving rise to a number of new viruses occurring in Bombyx mowii, but not necessarily creating diseases. And we made this plate here from some of the diseases we could find information about, and got our own photos and photos from friendly, nice people who sent us photos. So we could give also this paper as some sort of a way people could start to think of what they should look at. Insects with discolor, insects with fungus growth, insects with nematode inside, some bacterial spores, some fluid which could indicate a virus disease, and so on. We also made a survey to the companies we could get hold of at that time. There were some companies, and we simply asked them, what have you recorded or noticed any diseases in housefly, black soldier flies, house cricket, and mealworms? And we got some responses back. We did not reveal the name of the companies, but we said to them we would diagnose for them for free, just as long as they would give us the information to share. What is really interesting here is with black soldier fly, none of the producers at that time have noted any disease agent or nothing. It seemed to be very resistant to that fly, but it is not really so. We also produced these sheets for free distribution. This is the sheet on tenebrio, how different insect diseases could look, or diseases and disorders. And then we distributed to those who wanted it. It was available on the web. And our recommendation was that people should cover it with plastic and then let it stay in the production facilities so that those guys working there, they could have it just by hand if they got across something like that. Because now this is a little bit about fungal and bacterial diseases. This is tenebrio again. It is the the fungi, they make external symptoms. That's fine. So the yellow one arrows points towards larvae infected with Beauveria bassiana, generalist insect pathogenic fungus. The green arrow points towards a larvae infected with another generalist Metarhizium anisopliae, while the blue arrow, it's just some fluffy superficial growth of some other fungus, a saprotroph. And the red one, it points towards the larvae, which is infected, or at least it is hampered by some sort of bacterium, which may be a saprotroph as well. So there's a diagnostic challenge here to separate infectious organisms from saprotrophs. Now, we compiled this also lately, this one can say challenge to discriminate between insect pathogenic microorganisms already present or introduced into the system, or vertebrate pathogenic organisms already present or introduced into the production system, and the number 3, the shared group of those which are generalist and may in some cases infect insects, or in some cases they may also be harmful to humans or at least vertebrates. And here, by writing this chapter in 2022, we got it was a challenge also for us, because the author team included people from veterinary science, food science, insect pathologists, and an interesting point was to agree how we termed the different types of organisms, because each group of people mentioned here, scientists, they have in some ways, their own vocabulary. We moved to black soldier fly. The knowledge of bacterial, viral, and fungal pathogens or potential pathogens has increased significantly over the last few years. While classical diagnostic methods, symptoms finding the causative agent, have been known for a long time, molecular methods have been implemented more recently. This is our sheet from 2019 about diseases and disorders in black soldier fly. Of course, it's outdated, but I will still recommend such informative sheets, which are handy and can be placed in the production systems. A challenge as well here, upper left, this is not black soldier fly, but you can see the house fly. The house upper left, it is infected and killed by a fungus, Entomophora muscae. The next one, on the right to that one, maybe it was killed by that one, but the white band we see on the abdomen, it is caused by some saprotrophic fungus. It's not the causative agent. Upper right, many of the samples we received from companies where a black soldier fly has died, it seemed merely to be growth of, in this case, bacteria or other microorganisms because of some sort of environmental conditions which were no good for the black soldier fly. Lower left, we didn't find any microorganisms here, so it could be actually a disorder, genetic disorder. And lower right, it is a fungus infecting Beauveria bassiana, infecting adult flies. Now, starting then, and I'll go further with the black soldier fly here, it has a microbiome and microbe interactions. Of course it has. And people here, this team here, have studied, and this is just a small extract from the table. They found a lot of genera of microorganisms forming the microbiome. And how do we get from here to know which are important for the welfare and the health status of the insects? There's a challenge here, because one can say with these methods, one can find all these genera, but what is their impact really? Here, another example here, that black soldier fly, that's one of the reasons why it may be relatively resistant. they can temporarily modulate their immune response, phenyloxidase activation, and AMP gene expression to combat a pathogen within the hemolymph. They're some sort of strong to do that, and it was an experimental study here done in the Netherlands. But also, they can even some of the this black soldier fly can produce some antimicrobial compounds, which in this case here can fight the phytopathogen, Magnaporthe oryzae, and Colitotrichum. And maybe these fungi can be useful, these compounds can be useful in control of these fungi. Who knows, there's something to work on here. They can also, compounds from black soldier fly, inhibit zoonotic pathogens naturally found in pig, seen here on the petri dishes, a classical method to see the inhibition zones when black soldier fly are inactivate Staphylococcus and Salmonella. Now, here we get to an interesting point as well. This group here, also in a very recent paper, they identify pathogenic bacteria from black soldier fly larvae, and this is Panibacillus. Oh, it's a horrible name, the species name, Thiaminolyticus. Well, but it's an opportunistic one, and it's one of these bacteria which are not so good to have for a vertebrate health perspective. It's the only report I've seen of that, so who knows if it is a phenomenon it is important to look after, or if it is something simply happened on a special occasion here, in this case in China. We reviewed the list of pathogens on not only black soldier fly, but the list of pathogens on Diptera in this paper here. It was actually done in a collaboration with Protix staff members in the Netherlands, and we made a long list to this, which are and our suggestions to diagnose by checking first symptoms. And first symptoms, one can say it's some sort of the opposite compared to go in and do molecular work. In this case here, first symptoms means that we look and pick out spores or do something else to determine the pathogen. It's a very classical thing, and then eventually follow up by molecular means. Here it's an example of our work with in the laboratory where we could infect adult black soldier fly with the fungus Bovera bassiana in an experimental setup. But interesting, this is possible in the lab, absolutely. Bovera bassiana can infect all type of insects, but it does not seem to be a problem in the BSF rearings so far. At least we haven't heard of it being some sort of a problem. So and if we go further here, this group here, they even studied the effect on Bovera on the growth of the larvae. Larvae were susceptible when exposed in dipping assays or feeding assays. And as you can see in one extract from the results, in feeding assays, the body weight decreased really significantly. And now the virus links a bit up to Judy's presentation, also the implementation of novel molecular tools. In this case, that has led to discovery of two novel viruses associated with the black soldier fly, an nairovirus and an uncharacterized Bunia virus. The authors suggest routine surveillance of the black soldier fly colonies to check for these. Now let's stand a bit and then move to this one. Also came out, was it 2 years after? Yep, came out this year. where another team, they've added 5 new species of virus found also in black soldier fly by molecular methods. Solinivirus, flavivirus, cripavirus, encevirus, lipotivirus. These authors also suggest routine black soldier fly colony surveillance. And here I speculate a bit. Are we sure, please correct me if I'm wrong, but are we sure it's sort of worth it at the time being to screen against all these viruses before we know if they are really capable of creating mortality, establishing epidemics, dispersed to other rearings, and so on? Yeah, because there could also be other microorganisms besides bacteria, fungi, viruses worth to screen for. Mycosporidia and neogregarines, these groups of microorganisms, when the pathogenic ones, they can actually be present in a population and they can do harm, but more or less be unnoticed because there are no external symptoms, no dramatic, nothing. But anyway, they can be relatively harmful. We did a job a couple of years ago where we screened for neogregarines for a company in their production of tenebrio. It was, God thanks, it was not a problem as such, but they actually wanted us to do this screening. All these screenings and diagnostic things, it leads back to the problem which has been mentioned before, also by Benjamin, that there's some sort of no lab where people can get a check on all types of pathogens at the same time. In Europe, we had so far some sort of distributed the task a little bit. Virus checks, that's in the Netherlands. Fungal checks can be with us. Bacterial check, that could be with the INRA group, and so on. But no one labs exist which can take in any production insect and screen for all these potential pathogens. Finally, here with the pathogens, I should mention that parasitoids, there's actually some more to look for here. Rothko, he published a paper last year where he compiled some of the information about parasitoids which have been noted or found in black soldier fly. It's hard to know if what is the status of these parasites. Are they important? Are all determinations correct? Insect taxonomists are highly needed, and studies in life cycles are really highly needed. We cannot just neglect the parasitoids. Here, but we can focus a little bit on how we can also, with the production facilities, ensure the best way to avoid insect pathogens. They may emerge from on the figures on the right here. They may emerge via the feed brought in. Some of this can be brought in, and then via insects which are somehow sneaking in. This is especially the case if it's in a warmer climate, where some insect production takes place just by some netting and not entirely closed production systems. We can see here how it looks in closed production systems. Black soldier fly, tenebrio, and lesser mealworm. These photos are obvious to most of us, right? We have seen that, and in general, insects are well protected from external sources, except from the feed brought in. And here, cricket production, 2 species here in semi-open facilities in Thailand. There are 2 things which might be, you can say, enhance a little bit the risk for infections. One thing is that you have these open semi-open facilities, so you can other crickets or even the house crickets and the gryllus may come from the exterior and come inside and infect. And also, since adults and nymphs are at the same places, it can spread rapidly. And we shouldn't forget the other way around. Infected crickets can also move outside and infect the native crickets, which they shouldn't do. In conclusion, black soldier flies seem so far relative resistance anyway to many pathogenic microorganisms. The larvae have a strong immune defense. Some generalist bacterial pathogens can harm BSF larvae. Such pathogens may in addition pose a potential risk for humans. Fungal pathogens can be diagnosed by classical methods. Specialist viral pathogens, potential covert latent, have been found, and more are surely to be found. Routine methods to check for virus should be performed with the notes I made just before, because we still need an understanding which virus will actually really harm the black soldier fly. Do not forget to check for microsporidia and neogregarines. And bottom end is anyway, professional inspection of the rearing is needed at regular intervals anyway. Just in some cases, use a magnifying glass that will help you a little bit, and use your eyes and your knowledge. Let me see. That was it. I will stop sharing. Whoopsie. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And we have time for just a couple of questions. So first question coming in is about what would be the preventative measures for viruses at cricket farms? And it would be great if you would chat about that both in the context of closed production and also semi-open production.
Yeah, well, not specifically just about crickets, but one of the things I know, for example, that's when people produce insect virus for biocontrol, where they have a stock production of insects, for example, a cutting moth, and they have a production of virus at the same place. One thing is efficient doors. Another thing is to monitor carefully. A third thing is to sterilize. And the fourth practical thing is for the staff, when they have worked at a place where the potential is virus, that's the last thing they do that day. Then they go home and wash their clothes. Do not go have this re-entry from one facility to another. Isolate at regular intervals, isolate and keep in quarantine some of the production insects so that you are ready to reinitiate a production with your screened and healthy small population. That's what I just could consider here, and get professional help from virologists, by the way.
Great. So we're going to move on to our last speaker before we have our panel discussion. There will be more time for questions then. So our last speaker today is Katie Krebs. She obtained her veterinary degree from the University of California, Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, but she now joins us from the Rowan University Schreiber School of Veterinary Medicine. And she's coming to us today as a member of the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium, which is a group in the United States that deals with honeybee health. So welcome, Katie, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen here. All right, how are we looking there?
Looks
Looking all
great.
right? Okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much for having me. And I feel like I have maybe a slightly different background than most of the people on this webinar session today. I am a veterinarian. I've kind of been all over the place. I practiced in California before kind of moving to Canada, and I've practiced on the East Coast here for a while. And I kind of fell into honeybee medicine as initially a hobby. And we'll talk a little bit more about why veterinarians are needed in the honeybee health realm, but I will say that that's not my day job. I am primarily a dog and cat veterinarian, and I kind of moonlight as a bee veterinarian as well. And that's pretty much true for most of us members of the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium, as well as other veterinarians that practice bee medicine. It's not a large field, but it certainly is something that's growing due to some of the kind of legal implications and things that I was asked to speak about today. And so I'm coming to you guys, I think, kind of from a unique perspective, because in the United States, beekeepers do need veterinarians to obtain medications, and that's different. There's a little bit more oversight now than in some of the other, I believe in some other countries, as well as in other sectors of insect health and welfare. And so I'm coming at this from a veterinarian's perspective, where obviously I am concerned about the honeybee welfare and things like that. And hopefully I can show you guys that veterinarians can work really well with beekeepers to kind of achieve everybody's goals. So with that, we will get started. So just kind of a brief roadmap of where we're going to go today. I'm going to start out by just kind of explaining the why. What is the role of the veterinarian in bee health? And then we'll talk about establishing the veterinary client-patient relationship. So what that looks like for the beekeeper, what that looks like from the veterinarian's perspective, and what veterinarians actually can do for beekeepers. And then we'll wrap up by talking about prescribing and treating honeybees, and why veterinarians are crucial in that role. And before we get too far into it, I just want to point out that according to the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, honeybees are considered food production animals, so they're considered livestock, not wildlife. And that changes the way that they're regulated, and that's kind of the whole reason why they're grouped under some of these laws and regulations that we have in the United States, because they are considered wildlife, they are considered food production animals, and so as such, they get regulated the same as some of our other food production species that we more typically think about. So we'll get into it with the why and what is the role of the veterinarian in honeybee health. And so from a legal perspective, the U.S. Department of Agriculture passed the Veterinary Feed Directive in 2017. And this is really when the veterinary community was like, okay, that's cool. We don't really know anything about honeybees. We don't really learn about them in school, or I guess at that point we didn't. And the honeybee community, the beekeeping community, was like, okay, now we can't get what we need to get to treat our bees appropriately. And so it kind of came out of nowhere with not a lot of planning from a veterinary side or from a beekeeping side. But it helped to regulate the FDA's medically important antimicrobials. And basically what this law does is it requires this veterinary client-patient relationship between the veterinarian and the beekeeper in order for that beekeeper to obtain the antibiotics that they were previously able to get without the assistance of a veterinarian. So let's get a little bit more into that. This veterinary feed directive, again, it passed in 2017, so it's still fairly new. It's only been about 8 years that we've been working under this framework. But it did fundamentally change how medically important drugs could be used in food producing animals. So not just our traditional livestock species like cattle and sheep and chickens or whatever animals we're using for food. Honeybees were included in this as well, and it did fundamentally change how beekeepers could obtain the drugs that they needed as well. The whole goal of this was to support antimicrobial stewardship. And so there really was, and there still is, a big push to, be really cognizant of the antibiotics, antifungals, other antimicrobials that we might be using that might be deemed, critically important for human medicine. And there's this real big push, especially in veterinary medicine and in the human medical profession as well, to really be aware of what we're using so that we're not breeding more antimicrobial resistance, and that we're able to use these antibiotics, these antimicrobials that we have that are really important in human medicine, that we're not overusing them, breeding superbugs, and, you know, being harmful to the human medical kind of system down the road. And a lot of this abuse of antibiotics or antimicrobials in general has come from the production side, where people are using these antimicrobials irresponsibly or not in the way that they were meant to, and not following, you know, specific guidelines and things like that. And so we see that on the animal side, but then we also see that, especially in our food producing animals, we would see people getting exposed to medication from the food, from what they were, you know, using on a daily basis, that people didn't really think twice of on, you know, the food production side. And so we were seeing those medications and things get back into the human food supply, and that obviously leads to problems. And so that's kind of, you know, the whole push towards this veterinary feed directive is also to help support antimicrobial stewardship so that we have these critically important antimicrobials for longer in the human medical field. This also, you know, eliminated the use of drugs for production purposes. So things like growth hormone were significantly restricted. And the big change for our producers like beekeepers or other livestock producers was that these medically important antimicrobials now fell under the purview of veterinarians, and veterinarians were able to say, yes, you can use these for illness and maintenance of animal health, or no, we don't think your animal is sick enough, or, you know, this animal doesn't need this medication. And so it really came down to the veterinarian to say, you know, this is an appropriate use of this medication or it's not. And as you can imagine, for especially the beekeepers who had been using antibiotics prophylactically, or, you know, to treat problems that may or may not be there, they could, you know, go to Tractor Supply or their local beekeeping supplier and get these antibiotics. This was a very different and shocking way for them to have to change the way that they were treating their hives and the way that they were, you know, producing honey and providing pollinator services, because now there's this whole new level that they need a veterinarian to help them do something that they've been doing for years and years and years on their own. So that's fundamentally what the veterinary feed directive was. And what it comes down to is, for the beekeepers, if they need antibiotics, then you need a veterinarian. It became impossible for beekeepers to get antibiotics without a written note in a couple of different forms, which we'll talk about. But they needed a veterinarian to say, yes, you can have antibiotics for your hive. And again, this changed the way that beekeepers were able to raise the bees, to take care of their colonies. And so it was a big change just a couple years ago. So let's talk about what that change looks like. What does it look like to establish a veterinary client-patient relationship with a veterinarian, with a beekeeper, with the bees that these beekeepers are you know, using for their livelihood? So we'll start by just talking about what is a veterinary client-patient relationship. And it comes down to four main things from a veterinary side. So for me as a veterinarian, I assume responsibility for that patient. I must have sufficient knowledge of that patient and or the facility where that patient is being raised. And then I also must be able to provide the necessary follow-up and care for those patients. And then maintaining proper records. So the record situation kind of varies state by state, country by country. But in most situations, we have to keep records for at least 2 to 7 years, again, depending a little bit on where you practice. So what that comes down to is, me as a veterinarian, I have to know something about bees. I need to know something about bee diseases, and then I have to be able to appropriately treat bees. And I already mentioned that as veterinarians, we don't learn about bees in vet school. This was something that really kind of rocked the veterinary world as well, because now beekeepers were coming to us like, hey, we need antibiotics, and most veterinarians are not able to really provide that support. And so that's why us as the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium formed, was because of this. We formed this group to kind of provide that education for veterinarians that had already graduated but were interested in providing these services. So we're just going to kind of walk through what a veterinarian does when they visit an apiary or another, a hive location. And the first thing that we as veterinarians think of is biosecurity. And so this is obviously really important when we're traveling in between apiaries. We don't want to spread disease, but usually we're called out when there is disease. And so it's really critical for us to be able to travel between locations without spreading things. And so I always advise veterinarians and also beekeepers that I will be using the beekeeper's tools. I want to make sure that I'm using tools that have been in contact with the hives that are in question, or that are exposed to the disease that we're looking at, rather than taking them in between different apiaries. And then if there's some reason why I can't do that, it's critical to make sure that we're disinfecting our tools between apiaries. Most veterinarians that are doing this do have their own protective gear, but as a veterinarian, when I go out to hives, I've been offered protective gear from the producers that I'm working with, from the beekeepers, and that's always nice for me, because then I don't have to worry about disinfecting my own protective gear, and I can use the stuff that's been there with those hives already. But biosecurity is something that we definitely have to think about, especially when working in an apiary that might have one infected hive, but the rest of the hives are not infected, or if we're traveling between yards for the same beekeeper, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we don't want to be spreading disease. So when we're establishing a relationship, if any of you have pets or other livestock animals, or you've worked with veterinarians before, this should feel pretty familiar. It is very similar to what we would do in any other animal species to establish that veterinary client-patient relationship. And so I'm going to make sure that I'm taking a history. So looking at records, looking at notes from that hive, whatever other hives are in the apiary, whatever that beekeeper is able to provide me from a record standpoint, looking at, kind of the progression of disease, that's all going to be really helpful for me when I'm looking at, prescribing an antibiotic or diagnosing a disease. So that would be, similar if you took your dog or cat to the veterinarian, they're going to ask you like, hey, what's been going on with Fluffy or Fido? And then we have to do a physical examination. So we have to do a hive inspection. And in order to establish this relationship, we do actually have to get into the hives. And so that includes things like looking at brood health, looking at adult health, looking at the nutritional stores, looking for queen cells. Again, it's similar to any other physical exam that, maybe if you've had a dog or a cat or any other animal, we're doing a physical exam to look for signs of disease. In an apiary, it's a little bit different because we're looking at the overall hive health. We're not, doing exams on each individual bee. We're kind of looking at the hive as a whole, but we still have to get our hands in there and actually look at the state of the hive in order for us to be able to prescribe medications to the beekeeper. And so when we're doing a hive physical examination, we're looking at all the same things that the beekeeper would already be looking at when they're doing their hive inspections. And so I'm looking for external activity, things like activity at the entrance, robbing from neighboring hives, how many dead bees I might see around, just getting a general idea of what the state of the hive is before we get into it. I'm also going to want to look at the brood. And when we talk about the diseases that beekeepers do need veterinarians for, looking at the brood is going to be probably the most critical part. So What developmental stages do I have? Do I see eggs, larvae, pupa? Is there adequate nutrition in the brood chamber? And then what are the quality of cappings, especially on from a capped brood standpoint? What do those cappings look like? Does the brood overall look healthy, or am I seeing signs of disease? And then, of course, we're going to take a look at the queen. Is she present? What does her laying pattern look like? Are there queen cells? Did this hive swarm recently? We're going to be looking at, the overall health of not only the brood, the adult bees, and the queen as well. So again, we do have to actually get in there and get our hands a little bit dirty. So what do beekeepers need veterinarians for? And there's really only legally 2 things that beekeepers would require me for, because there's only antibiotics that are labeled for 2 diseases. There are other things that I get calls for all the time, and we can talk about that more a little bit at the end. But really what it comes down to is if a beekeeper has European foul brood or American foul brood, they need me as a veterinarian to prescribe them antibiotics. So just briefly, European foul brood, these are both, or foul brood in general, these are both bacterial diseases. European foul brood is spread by Melissococcus pluton. It tends to be a stress disease, and so sometimes I won't start by prescribing antibiotics if there's, less than, let's say, 10% of the brood affected. Then maybe we'll start by identifying what is actually stressing this hive out, and we can kind of go from there. Sometimes we do need antibiotics though. So that it's one of the diseases that they would need a veterinarian for. The other is American foul brood, spread by Painy bacillus larvae. And this is really bad. Most of the time, the antibiotics that I prescribe are not going to save these hives. And it's really in the treatment of these 2 diseases that beekeepers were prophylactically treating hives, so treating hives without actual evidence of disease, just to kind of make sure that they're keeping diseases at bay. And that, again, leads to potentially down the road antimicrobial resistance and things like that. And so veterinarians had to get involved in order to make sure that we have a diagnosis of one of these 2 diseases that actually calls for antibiotics. So let's talk a little bit about prescribing and treating the bees. So when it comes to honeybee antibiotics, there's really only 3 antibiotics that we even can use, that we can reach for. And all of them do require a veterinary feed directive or a prescription from a veterinarian. And the difference between the 2 really just depends on the formulation that we're using. Some we can use with a written prescription. Some do have to be VFDs that we will write up, and they can mix the antibiotic. The beekeeper can mix the antibiotic in the food. So when it comes to European foul brood, there's only one antibiotic that we can reach for, and that's oxytetracycline. When it comes to American foul brood, we can reach for oxytetracycline, tylosin, or lincomycin. But again, when it comes to American foul brood, we're not really going to be able to fix the problem long-term adequately in most situations. So we do have a couple of different options to try and, kind of keep things at bay. Once that bacteria forms spores in the hive, we do need to take more extreme measures. So prescribing antibiotics for American foul brood, like I just kind of alluded to, the vegetative infective stage is susceptible to all 3 antibiotics that we can reach for honeybees. That's the oxytetracycline, lincomycin, and tylosin. The spore forming stage is highly resistant, and if we're seeing spores forming in the hive, we have to burn all of the bees and all of the equipment. I mean, this is a reportable disease in some states in the United States. And so it's important for us as veterinarians to know, like, these are what we actually can and can't do. This is who we need to report to, and, get some people like the state apiarists involved in making decisions for those hives. When it comes to European foul brood, oxytetracycline is the only FDA-approved drug for European foul brood. And so we can put antibiotics on these hives, and we'll talk a little bit more about withdrawal periods and things, but it's important to note that antibiotics have to be removed at least 6 weeks before the main honey flow, especially, again, under these rules and regulations, so that the antibiotics don't end up in the honey, don't end up in the human food supply, and that we're being cognizant of that. So how do we treat honeybees? This is probably pretty similar to other insects, although I'll be totally honest, I'm not familiar with a lot of other insects because they don't really fall under my purview, as far as veterinary medicine goes, at least. But when we treat honeybees, we do put the antibiotics in sugar water or powdered sugar. The treatment period varies depending on what we're treating, the severity of disease, how that hive responds. And then we do need to remove honey supers during treatment, or make sure that we're really, really diligent about marking them so that they don't end up in the food chain for human consumption. If we're treating these honeybees at the beginning of the season, we want to remove antibiotics 6 weeks before the nectar flow to prevent contamination of the honey, to prevent that honey from going into the food supply. So there's a couple of other laws that I'll just kind of throw out there that honeybees somewhat fall into. So AMDUCA, or the Animal Medical Drug Use Classification Act, or Clarification Act, excuse me. This is from the 1990s, and it allows veterinarians to prescribe extra label uses of certain approved drugs under certain conditions. And so, for example, with honeybees, there are some lincomycin powdered products that are not specifically labeled for honeybees, but because lincomycin as a medication is approved for honeybees, then we can use some of these different formulations off label to treat these species if we need to. There's also the Food Animal Residue Avoidance and Depletion Program. This kind of provides guidelines for withdrawal periods based on labeled use, drug completion, and basically this is where we get the kind of fact that we need to remove honey supers for treatment periods, and then to follow that withholding period of removing antibiotics at least 6 weeks before the main nectar flow and things like that. That's where that law comes into place, is with our withdrawal periods. And then this also tells us that the veterinary feed directives are only good for 6 months. So when we are working with beekeepers, we can usually get them through a whole season with one VFD. But again, depending on when we do things, where what we're treating, this can vary a little bit. But a veterinary feed directive is only good for 6 months for those producers. And then the other thing that I just briefly wanted to touch on is the use of pesticides. And pesticides, which we do use in beekeeping to help with treating mites and things like that, but is also used in other methods of farming where bees might be foraging on those plants. Pesticide use is not regulated by veterinarians, but as a veterinarian, I get more calls to help beekeepers treat mites than almost anything else. And so, having some background knowledge of that is really helpful, especially to beekeepers that maybe don't know what the best mite treatments are, or they're having issues with previous treatments that they have maybe used for years and years. They're seeing resistance and things like that. And so it's really important to always keep records so that as a veterinarian, I can see what the beekeeper's done previously, or what they may have already tried, if they're doing things appropriately. But then we also want to consider, because bees are out in the environment, they're foraging, they're traveling away from their hives. We do have to think about what's happening in the surrounding areas as well, on other farms, in neighboring areas, and even what other animals, other livestock species might be getting treated with that could affect the honeybees as well. In the United States, you can test honey for pesticide residue. It's not really widely used, but it is an available service. And then again, we do need to think about withdrawal periods. This is kind of where that comes in again, where FARAD comes in. Looking at withdrawal periods of certain drugs, certain pesticides and mite treatments that might have more prolonged withdrawal periods or affect the honey as well. We certainly don't want pesticide residue in our honey that we're going to be eating. So just to kind of sum this up, the relationship between the veterinarian and the beekeeper is overall fairly straightforward, but it can seem quite intimidating, especially because this is something new that beekeepers and veterinarians weren't used to prior to 2017. So as the veterinarian, we assume responsibility for the patient. We have to have sufficient knowledge of the patient and the facility, and we must provide the necessary follow-up and care. The beekeeper also enters into this relationship. They agree to follow the instructions of the veterinarian, and they agree to apply antibiotics as directed. So, in theory, the beekeeper shouldn't be going rogue and treating things differently than the way the veterinarian has prescribed them. So how vets can be helpful to beekeepers as a veterinarian, and this is what we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, veterinarians can write scripts and veterinary feed directives for antibiotics when the beekeepers need them. But as a veterinarian, I acknowledge I've been a beekeeper for about 10 years myself, but not all veterinarians are beekeepers. And it's important for us to know who to work with. People like the state apiarists to help with diagnosing and treating different diseases, to help in, outbreak situations when there's die-offs and things like that. As a veterinarian, I also can beginning beekeepers or help, more advanced beekeepers when treatments aren't working. This is really where the mite treatments and things come into play. I really do get a lot of questions from, especially new beekeepers about their mite treatments and how to, adequately treat their bees, even though that's not something that as a veterinarian I'm required to know about. I can also help find sources for testing treatment. There's lots of USDA laboratories that we work with regularly. And then I also, or veterinarians in general, can help understand the state and federal regulations. So in the US, we have the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium, which provides lots of continuing education for veterinarians and researchers and just those that are bee curious about, how to treat honeybees, how to start working with honeybees, things like that. And they also provide a directory of how to find a bee veterinarian in your area. So those of us that are willing to work with bees, because it's not every veterinarian. And that's one of the big issues, is that in my area where I'm at, I am one of only 2 beekeepers in the entire state that are willing to treat bees. And so I've had to travel multiple hours to go to people's apiaries to help them to prescribe antibiotics and things like that. And so it can be quite cumbersome from a veterinary standpoint, but also from a beekeeping standpoint if you're not able to get what you need when you need it. For veterinarians, there's also a great website, beesneedvets.com, and it helps veterinarians to get some of that additional education that they didn't get in vet school. And so with that, I think I've taken most of my time here, but I don't know if we have time for questions, or if there are any questions. You guys are always welcome to email me. My email's on the slide there, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and very informative. I certainly learned a lot, especially about the US context and the kinds of rules and regulations we have. What I'm going to do is have our other panelists start to wake back up and come back, because we will head right into the panel discussion. But I'll start with a question for you, Katie, to get us started on this. So this is from our other veterinarian on the call, Benjamin Kennedy, from the UK context. And he says, in the UK, we have moved away from antibiotics pretty much completely for foul brood, as historically it was used to manage hives rather than clear foul brood. What are your thoughts on shook swarming or destruction? It's been relatively successful in the UK and Europe to manage these diseases.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think some of those other control methods maybe were a little bit outside of the scope of the talk here today. But yeah, especially for like European foul brood, that's definitely something that we can use and that we do use. And I agree, you know, historically beekeepers were using the antibiotics more for like management rather than treatment, and that's kind of where we got these regulations in the first place in the US. So I think there are certainly, when I don't have to prescribe antibiotics for beehives, I try not to, because there are other things that we can do, especially in European foul brood. There are other ways that we can, you know, treat stressors and maybe try and give that hive better chances before we jump to antibiotics. So yeah, good question.
And this was a question that was asked in one of the past talks. So, you know, there are all these insect farming diseases that we're finding that are emerging. What kinds of expertise are really needed? Like moving forward, what kinds of expertise do we want to see in this field that would best help both like the research of diseases in production systems, but also the treatment of those diseases?
Yeah, I think from a veterinary standpoint, I think really where the veterinary community is that we just don't have enough veterinarians that are willing to do this kind of work. Like it's certainly, at least in the United States, not something that we can do as a full-time job. I don't think I know any bee veterinarians that are regularly doing this as their sole line of work. And I think, you know, there's a lot of barriers to that, but just at least from a veterinary standpoint, and I certainly also do a little bit of honeybee research, but I, for the most part, leave that to the entomology PhDs and things like that. But I think, you know, dissemination of information is really key from a veterinary standpoint, and making sure that more veterinarians feel comfortable to do this, so that, you know, when I drive 3 hours out to a beekeeper to treat their hives, when I'm there for, you know, like 30 minutes, and then I have to drive 3 hours back home, and they tell me, we called our local veterinarian and they said they wouldn't do it because they don't feel comfortable. Like, you know, we can kind of more education to prevent situations like that from happening, so that beekeepers have more access to us as a profession, because it's just not really there yet.
Yeah, and other thoughts from, you know, other country contexts or other, you know, industry / academic perspectives on that same question.
I'll raise my hand. I mean, I think a lot of what Katie said, I would agree with. I think probably the biggest thing in my experience is enthusiasm. So the reality is we're at the beginning of this, and there is a lot of information that is there, but actually I don't think you need any specific expertise to get started. I just think you need to be enthusiastic and willing to talk to others. I mean, I really feel Katie's pain in her conversation, because I almost get the impression that, you know, it's so easy to become the only vet in that region. And actually, a lot of what I do is try to talk to other vets and get them doing what I'm doing, because, I mean, I still find it a little bit silly that me, an exotic vet, is becoming really involved in insect farming, when surely that's something a farm vet might do better than me. So a lot of what I've been doing over the last year or two is poking various farm vets in the eye and trying to get them to approach this more seriously and trying to support them in bridging that gap. So I think the main thing for me is just enthusiasm. You just need someone who's willing to give it a go.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. We're trying to do more education of veterinary students, even just from like this is how you open a beehive. And, you know, it doesn't have to be like you have that expertise. You just have to be, like you said, enthusiastic and willing to do the work. And so I feel your pain too.
And Benoit, from kind of the industry side, you know, what do you think insect producers, you know, either, I know beekeepers are not the IPIF focus, but, you know, insect producers that are working in these larger scale systems, crickets, black soldier fly, yellow mealworm, you know, what would be most helpful to those producers from a health, disease, and veterinary perspective?
Actually, it's something we don't know. Actually, if something happened, we just call a researcher and send picture and see what we can do. But really, as Cathy said, we cannot call anybody. So fortunately, we work with a decentralized model. So if something happens, we know that we can isolate one building, close it, clean it, and start again, because our production is in different locations. But out of that, we don't really know what to do, which is quite, stressing, stressful.
For sure. And I guess, Katie, a question for you on, this recent shift to having a regulatory framework for bees. You mentioned there hadn't been a regulatory framework. It was kind of every beekeeper could get their antibiotics and use them. Now, all of a sudden, we have this shift. And I remember when I attended the last HBVC meeting, we talked a little bit about the struggles that shift from lack of regulation to regulation caused for beekeepers. And so I wondered, now that it's been approaching a decade since that shift happened, what do you see as kind of the pros and cons of having that framework, both for the beekeepers and for the vets?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question because it has been around for a decade or so now, and I feel like we're still in like year 5. Like it doesn't really feel like it's been that long, just because it's not really. It's still not really something that people are talking about, although it is, I will say, maybe the last year or two, something that's come up a lot more frequently. But I think from a pro side, like really the antimicrobial stewardship is the key. For the most part, beekeepers have been doing this for years and years and years without veterinarians. Like they don't need us, right? But I think from like a One Health standpoint, where we're looking at human health and animal health and environmental health kind of all together, from that One Health standpoint, I'm surprised that it didn't happen sooner, truly. And so I think from that perspective, that's a pro, because I do think that the regulation of these antibiotics is going to be better for the world in general. But I think there's still more pain points than there are pros. I think from a beekeeper side, like it's hard to get veterinarians to come out and to find veterinarians that are willing to treat bees. I think, from a veterinary standpoint, like, that for those of us that have been out of school for a while, it's not something that we learned about in school. But I do think that there's starting to become more buzz, for lack of a better word, around this in veterinary schools and within some of the younger people. Like this is starting to gain traction, but like you said, we're 10 years into this and we're still like, I'm the only beekeeper probably within 5 hours of my location that's also a veterinarian that's also willing to do this. So like I'm lucky that I'm both a beekeeper and a veterinarian, and I understand both sides and I have good relationships with people, but that's not the case everywhere. And there's only like, I don't know, 200 of us in the entire United States that are willing to do that work. So that's still something that we're struggling with.
Yeah, so that definitely sounds like, some training and like maybe incentive structures to be able to get veterinarians that are not necessarily more specialized, but have the skill set to kind of move into these new kinds of production systems would be really helpful, along with what we've been talking about all day of just needing like a greater evidence base for this kind of work. So I guess a question for the academics on the call. So, one thing that we've been talking about is disease discovery and coordination on that. And I guess I wondered, what would you recommend for producers that think they have a disease or have a disease X, as Benjamin called them? They're having some kind of symptomatic outbreak of something. What would you recommend they do, both personally for their own production facility, but also for the collective, right? To try and help all insect producers everywhere understand these health and disease issues. What would be steps 1, 2, and 3?
So for someone who receives a lot of insects that happen to encounter this exact problem, that there is an outbreak at a farm and they don't know what to do, for us the best is that you freeze them immediately in quite significant quantities. Don't just freeze a tiny bag worth of maybe 5 individuals here take it, but actually freeze like 100, 200. You have a lot of carcasses in this case, and it also helps us if you freeze more that aren't dead yet. Just you know that they are gonna die quite soon, because for some viruses, for instance, I'm a virologist, so I'm gonna answer this from a virus perspective, but for some viruses, it might be too late when they are already a mushy carcass and we won't find much on it. By the time it reaches us, it's already lost integrity, so we can't look at it. That's why it's essential to have fresh ones too. Whereas putrefaction helps purification with some viruses, such as densoviruses, but it's really not the norm. So yeah, this is what to do, and to how to eliminate it. Bleach is good against even the worst densoviral infection, even though these have very resilient variants. If you can isolate the infection, that's great. Then call everything and just clean all equipment, all areas, everything that touched that colony with 10% bleach very thoroughly, scrubbing all the surfaces. That should take care of any type of viral infection.
Yeah, and Jürgen.
Add on that, I agree with these points here. So I suggest that some of the labs make clear, short guidelines how to preserve material, do this, so many samples or whatever, and have a check scheme to check that you have done this. And then next is to ship it, of course, and to contact. And at least I know that in the European Union or in Europe as such, we have a good coordination type of network, which is not some sort of a strictly organized, but it's merely, as I mentioned before, that we know that if it is a virus disease, let's quickly check with our good colleagues in Wageningen in the Netherlands or other groups, so we quickly can ship materials, photos, and experience, because no one can screen for everything, and no one has experience in all type of diseases. So the point is to get quickly into the network.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say we had a panelist comment, Loretta Mujo. She saying, thank you so much for the panelists for highlighting the status quo of the industry and what's needed going forward. I just want to mention there are now 15 freshly trained insect veterinarians under the EU Insect Doctors Program, and that, you know, Dr. Mujo is one of them. So hopefully they can connect further with industry and academia and, you know, build up the colony management and health infrastructure, at least in Europe, which would be great. Benjamin. You raised your hand.
So I think very good points made by both. Just thinking about this practically, and I could really feel Benno's pain, because I've had this discussion from insect farmers where the insect farmer is having a problem and they have no one to act straight away, because often you need straight away action. I would say a general good bit of advice is to contact your local exotic vet. Let them have a wee moment to deal with the fact that you're talking about insects, and then ask them for advice as to what sample collection methods they would recommend, because most of the time, if it works for a reptile slash bird slash amphibian, it would probably work for an insect. Because I think certainly I've been there and I've had that discussion with an insect farmer, and they're telling me they had X problem 3 months ago and now they're having it again. And I had that moment. I go, well, actually, if you had frozen some, fixed some, you know, we would have a data point. So I feel like there's a lot the industry could do to get better at understanding how to investigate disease. And, you know, I think vets, even basic vets, have those principles built into them straight away.
Yeah, and Dr. Eilenberg, you raised your hand.
Yeah, two short comments. One thing is, I think you mentioned, Megan, that insect doctors educated 15 vet insects doctors, or whatever you call it. We have to be aware here, because when we started the program, in my press release on this, we happily mentioned that we will educate the insect vets. And then we were told by the Veterinary Doctors Association that this was a no-go, because to be a veterinarian is a protected title. You have to graduate from a veterinary school to call yourself a vet. So the term insect vets is a term you should be very careful to use in public. Am I right with this, Katie and Benjamin?
Yeah.
It's not,
So I have no personal knowledge about this individual status as such.
It's not against vets or something. It's just we realized that that we have to be careful with this term.
Absolutely.
So an insect health consultant or something.
Yeah,
I mean,
and we call it, by the way, then we finally called it Insect Doctors Program, when we call it that anyway, and we have had no complaints from the medical doctors.
Maybe they don't think people are getting confused. Katie, a question for you. You were talking about mite treatments, and that there are these treatments for varroa mites that don't harm insects. And so I know nothing at all about mite treatments, but I do know that sometimes we also get mites in production facilities. And I wondered if you could speak to what some of those treatments are, and if you know the mechanism of action where it does kind of kill the mites, but doesn't kill the beneficial insect you're trying to protect.
Yeah, so great question. There are a ton of different chemical products out there. In the beekeeping world, we call it integrated pest management. So because mites are arachnids, not insects, we can use specific treatments for them rather that don't harm the bees. So there's a ton of different chemical things out there. And then we also use, as part of integrated pest management, we can use physical control methods, like in beekeeping, we can use swarms or brood breaks as periods of time where the mites can't reproduce as well. We can use like very specific things like drone comb, and like getting into kind of the nitty-gritty details of some of these is probably outside the scope of this, but like it's very specific to beekeeping. I don't know how much people really want me to get into like all of the biology of the bees and things like that. But there are a number of different ways that beekeepers have to do that, and kind of, because varroa mites, like you mentioned, are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. Beekeepers that don't treat for varroa have huge problems. And so this is something I run into with new beekeepers all the time, from we don't want to kill bees, we don't want to harm them, like, to test for diseases even. And because varroa mites can spread lots of viruses and things as well that look similar to some of our other diseases that are more harmful, it's education. People will call me and say like, hey, we have this disease, but it turns out they just have a severe varroa infestation, and that is a problem. And I will say just one more thing about this. We in the United States had a large die-off of honeybees earlier this year, in January, and there's tons of research being done on it, but right now it looks like it's varroa that was resistant to one of the main chemicals that we use to treat those mites. And so I don't know that this will be coming anytime soon, but I do think that there is or should be some push to better regulate or better manage the pesticides that we're using to kill the mites, because we are seeing resistance from the mites, and that is affecting our bee population now as well. And so, better record keeping, better mite management and things is something that, even though it's not under the purview of veterinarians right now, I do get calls for it a lot. And there, again, are a number of different ways that we can do that. And I suspect that probably applies across the insect industry as well, although I do not have any expertise in other insects, so maybe somebody else can chime in. But you know, we've had tons of different treatments for years and years and years that work really well. And so, you know, it will be interesting to see how that changes over the next handful of years.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. I know you have to run, so thank you for your talk. Thank you for coming and answering some questions on the panel, and I will spotlight Judith for the next comment.
Sorry, next comment. I just want to put it out there that so my team works on varroa mites and the viruses they spread currently. So if your colony collapsed and you don't know why, please send them to us, as well as if you do your mite checks and you get mites, use the sugar shake method, because we can't really do anything with ethanol-soaked samples. But we would love to receive those mites in your sugar shakes. So just wanted to put it out there. Please flood us with samples. Thank you.
That's super cool. Maybe we can connect offline and see if there's, like, you know, other research or other communities or, you know, like other samples that we can send you. That's really cool.
Yeah, definitely. So our idea is to learn more about these interactions between the bees, the mites, other hive pests, and how they spread, what kinds are out there, how specific they are, to discover new one, and even eventually harness them as biological control agent vectors. So really don't hesitate to send us your bees, mites, hive beetles, wax moths, everything.
Awesome. Yeah, we should definitely connect offline. That's cool. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And Benjamin.
I think Judith has just made the point I was going to make, which was it's really interesting looking at some of the research of Varroa, because it would appear there's a big viral burden within them, and probably a lot of beehive collapse is due to other things. I was just going to add on that I have used oxalic acid and some of these antiparasitics in other insects, and they can be quite helpful. Firstly, with oxalic acid in particular, less so amatraz, in that it sublimates and then breaks down really quickly. So actually for food producing things, there is a withdrawal period available. So it's one of those few bits of medicine where there is actually a little bit of information for insects. So I've particularly used it in research settings where there's a very important or special insect that has a mite burden, and actually it's been quite a good option, to be honest. Very good option.
And Benjamin, is that also true for mites in insects as food and feed that you're talking about, or just for honeybees?
So not just honeybees. So I think the way that my understanding of how oxalic acid in particular works is it's a dose dependent effect based on the thickness of the cuticle. So it also works in arachnids. If you have a large arachnid with thick cuticle, then the mites on that arachnid have very thin cuticles, so the oxalic acid penetrates and kills them. So I've not used it in food producing animals yet, because I'm usually so paranoid in food producing animals, but in settings where it's not food producing animals, I have, and it's been successful. So it's probably, if it ever came to it that there was a big ectoparasite burden, it probably is a drug that I would get loads of advice on using, but probably would reach to use potentially, because I think there's a well-established background to its use in bee medicine.
And I will add to that, oxalic acid is one of the very few medications that we can use to treat mites that doesn't require you to remove the honey from the hive. So it doesn't leave residues in the honey, and is pretty safe for use in hives. That's one of the mainstays of mite treatment in the US as well. And so I don't know how that would apply to insects for food, but it is safe for honey at least.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear, because we do sometimes have issues with, production systems that get a lot of mites. Often the mites aren't actually necessarily parasitic on the insects. They're sort of commensalists that have shown up to eat the grains that the insects are also eating. And we can even sometimes find in lab populations of insects as well that they will come in and not really seem to bother the lab insects, but just, hang out eating the lab insects' plentiful food source. So it could be great to have some techniques that are, safe and effective for mite control as well. And I know that some people use oxalic acid, I believe, for Drosophila mite control already. So it's not entirely unheard of in these kinds of systems. I did want to ask Benjamin a question of you about generations versus time. So you mentioned that you think folks should be quarantining not based on time, but based on generations. Could you say a little more about that?
I think so. This is really, again, this is one of those bits of advice which is practical yet impractical, because I know a lot of insect farms are sometimes replenishing stock from other farms, and those quarantine periods don't always happen. But I think, when you have a new set of insects that you bring into a system, I don't think you will see disease straight away. And I think you won't necessarily see disease until the next generation or two. So I think the ideal, if we were to produce a gold standard, would be you bring an insect species or an insect population into your system, you would keep them separately and actually run that insect through its production cycle so you can reveal all the problems. I mean, the other thing to also say is you won't necessarily see the problems until you've actually seen it in the instar afterwards. So, for instance, if you have a genetically weak line, you may get those breeders, they may produce eggs, but their fecundity would be low. And certainly before you would want to integrate that into your system, you would want to know about those problems first. So that's why I've sort of changed, because previously my advice would have been 3 months, but I've now since changed my approach to 2 generations, because then you see the issues of that breed of insect. Saying that, we're also admitting that there's probably so much sharing between different farms at the moment that I think it's almost a redundant thing to say right now. It may not be redundant in the future.
Okay, great. We have a follow-up question about oxalic acid from my postdoc, Dr. Dersharo, who's on the call as a backup host in case my internet went out. So he's asked if there's any expertise required to use oxalic acid to control mites.
It's not a complicated drug to use. It's really, I quite enjoy it. It's quite, because it sublimates, you just heat it up and then it becomes a gas and spreads into that area. It's certainly in my experience, I would define it as quite a simple drug. I mean, you've seen beekeepers just drop it in with a syringe into their hive and it sublimates itself through the heat within the hive. So it's a relatively simple drug, if that makes any sense. It doesn't require a special degree, or it just requires following instructions, really.
So this is a question that sort of came up from Katie's talk, but I think many of the people on the call could still help answer it. So Katie talked a little bit about, in European foul brood cases, how often the first thing that she recommends isn't actually an antibiotic, but to look at potential stressors and see if you could just reduce stress levels in the hive. I thought that was a really interesting strategy, like treatment through stressor removal instead of treatment through trying to kind of get rid of the disease agent. And so I wondered, what kinds of things should insect producers or beekeepers be looking at as potential stressors for their insects that could be contributing to disease incidence? And so, obviously there's the question specific in the honeybee case, but we could probably learn something more broadly about what stressors tend to contribute to insect disease outbreak from this.
I could talk for hours on this, so I'm going to let someone else answer first.
Well, Benoit, maybe you could start by just sharing what sorts of things you look at as someone who's involved in the industry, where you start to think, maybe something, is going wrong here and there's a stressor that we could try to remove.
I would say the primary stressors that I see in the limited cases I've seen would be a period of poor nutrition or a period of inappropriate diet, temperature extremes or humidity extremes.
Yeah.
I also think, depending on the way that we're breeding them and the way that we're producing them, population density is probably another one. So I think sometimes if you're trying to push your system too much and your population density is too high, then that becomes a stressor. I think there's lots of research which shows shaking them or having excessive vibration can be associated with cortisol release. So I think there are loads of different things that can contribute. I've also had issues with ventilation, when the ventilation sort of causes these little microclimates of mass humidity, which then causes stress. So I think in some respects, it's not really rocket science. I think this is where the argument of analogy is beautiful. Pretend it's a cow. What would stress out a cow would probably stress out an insect, but those would be the things I would start with. And I guess my other comment I would make is when we're seeing disease, it's usually due to stress or to some physiological stress, because the viruses they probably already have. The bacteria and the fungi are environmental primarily. The parasites are also probably stuff they already have. If we're seeing disease, it's probably those things that have been elicited by something else. So in my experience, the majority is due to some niggle in husbandry. In fact, I'll stop talking now because I could just keep going and going about this.
Yeah, I agree. All this kind of stress you mentioned, temperature, humidity, and so on, we can see that straight away in the cycle. I mean, the more stress you have, the longer will be the cycle. So if you want to get a better production, as you are an insect producer for us, we want the larvae to grow fast and to be strong. And if we stress them too much, they will take more time. And they won't complain like a chicken or a pig and cry, say, I need food or I'm hungry, but they will just stop growing. And it's so the way for us is to give them the best condition, and we'll see the results very, very quickly. But the stress also regarding mealworms, we consider when we put too many in the density, maybe they are the kind of communication, I don't know exactly, and they will say, okay, here we don't have too much food or too much feed, and they control, and they don't heat too much because they have to, I don't know how to explain that, but they consider the quantity of feed available, and they will grow according to that quantity available. So it's quite it's interesting to discuss. And also another stress we can see is regarding for mealworms, this can be checked with cannibalism, because it's part of the of the specificity of the mealworms. Sometimes they eat the eggs, right?
Yep. Yeah, you did.
So about the stress that it happened to me, especially when we put out the call to get superworm and mealworm samples from consumers that were possibly infected with virus, that they send me these samples. It happened with crickets too. They send me these samples, and then I ask them where they got the original stock from. They tell me, and I reach out to the farm, and then the farm is totally surprised that, like, oh, problems, production is great in here, everything is going fine. So this is how much stress means. Your farm is perfectly healthy. You ship out the insects to the buyers, and then they either arrive on dead, or either arrive dead on arrival, or or just as they start living their life in their new homes, all of a sudden they just come down with some infection, and all of them are devastated. This also emphasizes why is it so crucial to know about these pathogens, try to keep the insects healthy, because at their end destination they might behave completely different and will show completely different symptoms than they do at your farm, appearing completely healthy.
Yeah, and this transport question is really interesting. You know, there's this phenomenon sometimes called shipping sickness that can happen with crickets who are being shipped out primarily to people that are using them to feed their pets. And it's a phenomenon where the crickets get shipped out, they're alive, they're healthy, they're doing fine, and they reach the end user and they are suddenly not doing fine and not healthy. And the question is why? And so, of course, some of it could be transport associated stress, which, like Benjamin mentioned, is something we know happens for vertebrate livestock animals, but also has been studied a bit in honeybees, because honeybees are often transported long distances for pollination services in the United States. And one of the things that, you know, happens a lot in transport to these animals is that they get a lot of shaking, right? A lot of vibrations on those trucks. And so what Benjamin was referring to about the shaking and the vibrations causing stress in honeybees, it's been studied that it shows that it increases octopamine levels in both honeybees and crickets, which octopamine is the insect version kind of a stress hormone, a fight or flight type hormone, if you will. And so this suggests that, you know, there may be things that, while they're healthy and happy on the farm, aren't necessarily causing a lot of disease incidence or outbreak, but that once that transport associated stress has happened, can lead to negative health outcomes for the animals or mortality down the line. And that can be really important to consider for folks that are doing live transit of animals, which of course not every production model involves shipping out animals live to end users. Okay, well, I guess one last question, and then I guess we'll start to wrap up from there. Oh, another one came in on the chat. Okay, two questions, and then we'll wrap up. So the last one that just came in on the chat was, during Dr. Eilenberg's presentation, we heard the term routine testing mentioned several times. What could that look like for a producer?
I can tell you what I would recommend to my clients, and it would be interesting to see how many of the panel agree or disagree. For me, if someone wanted to do routine testing, I would recommend squash preps, ideally some form of culture on a homogenate of the internal anatomy of the insect, and histology, probably once every 3 to 6 months, depending on how paranoid the client wanted to be. Squash preps would cover most sort of your obvious parasites, not all of them, but your obvious ones, Gregarian, for instance, Nosemia. Histology would pick up things like, it's particularly helpful for looking at gastrointestinal contents. My baby is about to come in, so we might just hear some screaming or really excited voices. Things like culture and sensitivity would tell you your Serratia marcescens and your fungal disease and that sort of thing. And histology would potentially give you some clues for viral disease, though you wouldn't see it as viral inclusion bodies. You'd perhaps see it as excessive amounts of proteinaceous material in the fatty body. So that would be what I would call routine testing. So regular microbiology. Some of this stuff could easily be done by the farmer. I think a squash prep and a farmer with relative amounts of information would be very doable, quite economically by a farmer on site, but your things like histology wouldn't be. Happy to be corrected by Jordan. You'll probably tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. No, that's not my point. My point is merely that I agree that in many cases, much can be done simple by squeezing, by having a knowledge of what is important to look for, and don't some sort of and be aware what is maybe not worth to look for. Be aware what is simply insects which are dead for some reason, and then there's saprotrophs growing, and much of it doesn't need a a huge education in the subject. It needs common sense and some knowledge, and then to be aware and all this. Yep. Oops. Lower hand.
So last question. So we talked a little bit about the potential for antibiotic treatment in the future for insects that are used as food or feed. And there's a question about whether or not that can lead to like accumulation of antibiotics in the vertebrate animals that would be consuming the insects that had received the antibiotic treatment. And if so, does that mean that it should really only be used for reproductive, like breeder populations, and not for animals that are destined to become feed?
So I keep answering the questions. I'm really sorry, panel. I would say whenever you're using any medication, you need to have a good handle of the risk benefit and the cost benefit of what you're achieving with that medication. I think the problem we currently have is we don't have mean residue limits for many of these drugs in these food producing animals. And to be honest, that is a challenge. We really should, and the academics that are involved in this field are in the process of doing that, I'm sure. But until we have that, we are flying blind, and therefore we have to have a really good reason to treat for the risk of especially human consumption, but also animal consumption. It doesn't matter if these drugs are going into feed. If these drugs are going into feed, then you're potentially giving other animals antibiotic residues, and that's also not acceptable. No. So really, you have to have a good justification. Now, I think if in food producing animals, you would need to also inform your end user, the person who's taking the protein, or in whatever form, that this is a possibility, and you would ideally need to test it to make sure that those residue limits would be appropriate for another animal. So there's lots of logistical challenges if you do in producing animals. So it's not impossible. And I think if you have an incredibly high economic reason or a high welfare reason, i.e. these animals are the only sole food source for another animal that they're being bred for, maybe. But actually breeding animals, which are animals you're not intending to put into food producing, it's only going into eggs, your relative risk is low, not nothing, but low, that those eggs will produce animals with a substantive enough residue to be an issue. So is that kind of, again, could do a whole lecture on that if you guys wanted. But I think actually there's so little data. Your other issue is until you know how you can medicate it, and it's difficult to add it to food because it doesn't necessarily mix or integrate into the normal food sources we have for these animals. You're then also potentially putting a lot of effort into medicating these animals when you don't necessarily have a delivery method that is scalable or economical. This is a challenge of my life over the last year. So I could go, hence why I'm talking for England about it.
And the other point is, Kathy was talking about 6 weeks retention period. And when you talk about BSF, it's for life already. So you have no choice but not to use it.
Not all medications have that problem. So some of the coccidial agents that are used in chickens, they're not necessarily absorbed by the chickens. They're used to make it more difficult for the coccidia to form and adhere. Yeah. So different veterinary drugs have different withdrawal periods for a reason. The other thing to bear in mind is these animals are at a profoundly different temperature. They are metabolizing a lot quicker. It might well be that a withdrawal period in reality for these animals, it might be 5 or 7 days. It might be 125 days.
Exactly.
We don't know. So there may be loads of viable drugs, and they may not be the drugs that we think they are. Having tried to figure this out even slightly, there's a lot of drugs out there which don't work at all in insects, and others that work incredibly well, and we just don't have the data yet. I think it's coming, because I think if we have a food producing industry, it deserves veterinary care, because actually, poultry units are controlling their diseases with drugs. Not all of those drugs are antibiotics. Some of those drugs are very good, very effective. Every industry actually deserves that coverage. It shouldn't be restricted to mammalian. And actually, this is one of the fastest growing industries. It's one of the fastest growing livestock industries in Europe. It's huge. It's going to be huge if it continues to grow. We should be working to make this an option for farmers, because they deserve that option. I could pontificate about this for hours. I really could.
And I definitely take the point, that Cameron mentioned in his talk, and Benoit also alluded to in one of his answers to these questions, which is just that, there's a lot we don't know even about just how we would dose them, right? How much they eat. And if you look at, we rear black soldier fly in our lab, and if you take the first 7 days of a black soldier fly's life and the next 7 days of black soldier fly's life and the next 7 days of a black soldier fly's life, the amount they eat in each of those 7-day periods is radically different. Their behavior changes, their body size is different, their metabolism is different. And so even within just the larval period, we're not even talking about moving into adulthood. You get these radically different periods where trying to figure out how you would dose your BSF, you'd need to also know what's the density, what's the temperature, what's the feedstock. There's a lot of that kind of stuff to keep in mind. And Judith.
So just want to put it out there that antibiotics and other chemical-based medication are only the first step. We are just getting into insect vaccines, getting into viral agents, for instance, that could provide protection against other viral agents. So it's really just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm absolutely sure that there's more to come, which is also a reason why it's so important to keep researching insect pathogens and how we could counteract them. There have already been 2 insect vaccines patented, one for bees and the other one with it for superworms. So it's really growing dynamically. So antibiotics are only the beginning and not the end.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists so much for your brilliant talks, also all of your time answering questions in this panel session today. I've learned a tremendous amount. I have lots to think about. And so thank you for your time, for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate you. And thanks everyone also for staying for the talks today and for the panel discussion and asking great questions. This was wonderful, and thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.